The cave is silent except for the soft crumble of loosened earth and the distant drip of groundwater echoing through the darkness. Dust moves like ghost ash through the beams of the archaeologists' headlamps, settling on their gloves, their boots, their breaths. No one speaks. No one wants to. The air feels wrong here. Thick, metallic, strangely warm, as if the mountain itself remembers something it should have forgotten centuries ago. The team has been working for hours, brushing away layers of soil that look burned, compacted by sudden heat. The stone around them is blackened, and scattered across the floor are fragments of bones, some snapped, some fused by fire. Most belong to animals sacrificed long ago, but a few are unmistakably human. The presence of both terrifies and fascinates the lead excavator, who keeps glancing toward the narrow opening where a faint wind whistles in and out of the chamber like a warning. As the lights shift, a dull glimmer catches someone's eye. At first it looks like another charred stick, just another remnant of something destroyed. But this object has shape, intentional, preserved against all odds. A young researcher kneels, brushes it gently, and the outline becomes clear. A cylinder of something brittle and dark, sealed with a hardened lump of wax. Instantly, the room changes. The scrape of tools stops. Every person present seems to lean toward this single, fragile artifact as though pulled by gravity. Shouldn't be here. Scrolls simply do not appear in sites like this. Fire, time, and humidity destroy them. And yet this one survives. Blackened, yes, but intact enough to still hold its secrets. The wax seal bears a faint emblem, the outline of a lambda, the ancient Spartan mark. But the style is wrong. It is not the crisp, formal stamp of state messages. It feels personal, almost desperate. The lead archaeologist removes gloves with trembling fingers, sensing instinctively that this is not an ordinary find. They shine a light across its surface. The parchment is curled into itself, as if trying to hide the words written within. The outer layer is scorched and brittle, but the inside seems untouched, shielded by the very flame that tried to consume it. Around the scroll are remnants of what might once have been a leather pouch, now fused to the dirt. Someone tried to protect this. Someone expected it to be found, or desperately hoped it never would be. The team exchanges uneasy looks. They know Spartan history. They know the strict communication methods used by the military, the skittily rods, the coated strips of leather, the systematic destruction of sensitive messages. A scroll like this is an anomaly, contradiction, a violation of procedure so severe it would have been punishable by death. One of the archaeologists whispers, "Why hide a scroll in a place like this?" But the question is swallowed by the cavern before anyone can answer. The deeper they excavate, the more the story changes shape. Charcoal patches reveal deliberate burning, not accidental. The bones show signs of violent heat, but the soot on the walls climbs too high, too evenly, to be the result of a natural fire. The cave was sealed at some point, intentionally, forcefully. The presence of scorched Spartan-style spearheads near the entrance raises unsettling possibilities. Someone might have tried to destroy everything here, erase every trace, and yet preserved one object. The contradiction gnaws at the team. Destroy everything. Except this, when they lift the scroll from the soil, it feels heavier than its size should allow. Not in weight, but in presence. A strange sensation runs through the hands that touch it. A sense of trespassing, of stepping into a story no one was meant to hear. Above them, the wind sighs again, colder now, and loose gravel rains down the cave wall as if the mountain shudders. They place the scroll into a reinforced container. One of the researchers leans over and whispers, "This could be nothing, or it could rewrite everything we know." But the lead archaeologist doesn't respond. Their eyes are fixed on the soot-blackened parchment, staring as if the surface might peel open and speak on its own. The team begins to pack equipment, but the atmosphere has shifted. Their earlier excitement has turned into a quiet, electric dread. They don't just feel like they've discovered something. They feel like they've disturbed something. Something that wanted to stay buried beneath ash and silence. As they exit the cave, the sunlight seems too bright, almost accusing. Each step down the rocky slope feels uneasy, as if unseen eyes are watching from the shadows they leave behind. The container with the scroll is carried like a fragile bomb, carefully, reverently, fearfully. Far behind them, in the newly exposed cavern, the last beam of light catches the blackened wall. For a brief second, a faint symbol becomes visible, carved deeply into the stone. A Spartan lambda, and beneath it, a second mark almost erased by soot, a diagonal slash that could be a name, a warning, or a signature of someone who vanished long before written history cared to remember. The team doesn't see it, but they will feel the weight of it soon enough. And the scroll they carry, born from flame and secrecy, will become the first whisper of a story buried by Sparta itself. Orders from a commander who disappeared without leaving a single soldier behind, except perhaps this solitary message scorched into silence. The legend begins like a half-forgotten whisper, passed down by shepherds, carried by mountain winds, and dismissed by most historians as nothing more than a fireside tale. But every myth has a heartbeat, and this one pulses around a single man. A Spartan commander who marched into the wilderness with 300 trained warriors and was never seen again. No battlefield, no graves, no returning wounded, not even a scattered shield or broken spear left behind to mark where they fell. It was as if the earth simply opened its jaws and swallowed them whole. Ancient writers mention him only in fragments, always cautiously, as though invoking his memory carried danger. Some called him the Lost Polemarch, others the Commander of the Third Shadow. One chronicle describes him as a rising star within the Spartan hierarchy, trusted, disciplined, and almost frighteningly loyal to the laws of Lycoergos. Another hints that he clashed often with one of the ephors, challenging decisions others accepted without question. These details are inconsistent, but they all agree on one thing. His disappearance struck the city like a hidden blade. The event took place during a turbulent period in Spartan history, a time when internal tensions simmered beneath the polished exterior of unity. Helot unrest was rising in Messenia, foreign allies were growing skeptical, and the once iron discipline of Sparta had begun to show hairline fractures. Against this backdrop, the commander received an order, one so unusual that even seasoned scholars pause when recounting it. He was instructed to leave Sparta quietly, under the cloak of night, and take with him exactly 300 men. No heralds, no fanfare, no announcement to the other commanders. The mission was classified under a level of secrecy usually reserved for the Cryptia, the darkest arm of Spartan power. And then, silence. The first few days after the departure raised no alarm. Covert missions were not uncommon. The Cryptia often moved this way. But as a week passed, then too, whispers began creeping through the agoras and training grounds. Mothers noticed missing sons. Warriors questioned the absence of comrades. Even the elders began glancing toward the mountains with unease, wondering why no messages had returned. At first, the ephors responded with calm dismissals. The mission continues. The commander follows orders. Patience. But patience dissolved into concern, and concern into suspicion. When 3 months passed with no word, the anxiety inside Sparta curdled into something darker. Fear. Not fear of death. Spartans lived with death as naturally as breathing. But fear of betrayal, of secrecy, of internal fracture. Some whispered that the commander had uncovered something he was not meant to know. Others suggested he defected, though no Spartan had ever willingly abandoned his city and family. A more chilling rumor implied that the mission had not been military at all, but a silent purge, 300 men chosen because the state wished to remove them without public scrutiny. The truth remained locked behind sealed lips. The ephors neither confirmed nor denied anything. Instead, they erased the commander's name from several public inscriptions, a subtle but unmistakable sign that something was wrong. In Sparta, names were carved in stone to honor duty. Being removed from that stone was a symbolic execution. For years, local villagers living near the Taygetos Mountains claimed to see distant firelight at night, or hear rhythmic chanting drifting through the ravines. Hunters described glimpsing figures moving silently through the forests, tall, broad-shouldered, barefoot, carrying spears that glinted in moonlight. No one dared approach. They believed the spirits of warriors condemned to wander for failing their city dwelled there. Historians, of course, dismissed such tales as superstition. But when the blackened scroll emerged from that mountain cave centuries later, the legend resurfaced with startling force. Suddenly, the story of a vanished commander wasn't just folklore. It was a potential missing chapter in Spartan history. As researchers examined the scroll's seal and structure, they realized something strange. The wax bore a personal emblem, not an official state mark. This meant the scroll might not have been sent to the commander. It might have been written by him. The implications were staggering. If the scroll contained his final words, then Sparta did not simply lose 300 soldiers. It silenced them. And so the story transforms from myth into a haunting possibility. That the commander did not vanish because he failed, but because he succeeded in discovering something Sparta could not allow to return. Something dangerous enough that his entire unit was swallowed by the mountains, leaving only one fragile scroll to break the silence hundreds of years later. The discovery of the scroll forces us back into the commander's shadow, urging us to ask the question his own city refused to utter. What did he see out there, and why did he choose never to come home? Sparta was a city of paradoxes, simultaneously revered and feared, disciplined yet secretive, a society that celebrated openness in public ritual while cultivating shadows in private corners. To outsiders, it appeared as a rigid military machine, every citizen molded from youth to soldier, every action measured and precise. But beneath that polished exterior lay layers of secrecy so deep that even some Spartans themselves never fully understood them. The Cryptia, the hidden youth tasked with patrolling the countryside and eliminating threats, operated with almost mythical autonomy. They were both the eyes and the claws of the state, acting in ways the general population was never meant to witness. Every movement, every word, every act of violence was both instruction and lesson, instilling fear and obedience simultaneously. Spartan society relied on this duality of visibility and invisibility. Public life was rigidly structured. The agoge trained boys in endurance, strategy, and loyalty. Communal messes reinforced unity and hierarchy. Religious ceremonies honored gods with elaborate spectacle. Yet beneath this openness, every citizen knew there were secrets not to be spoken. Some were political, some were martial, and some bordered on the mystical. There were whispered codes, hidden signals, and silent agreements, behavior patterns that dictated life more than law itself. Breaking these unspoken rules could bring swift and merciless consequences, for the city's survival depended as much on silence as on swordsmanship. The scroll that surfaced in the cave is especially shocking when placed against this backdrop. Sparta did not communicate sensitive information with ink on parchment. Official orders, strategies, and messages were encoded in skytteles, strips of leather wrapped around rods, requiring both sender and receiver to share a secret method of reading. Every soldier trained from adolescence in these systems. Mistakes could cost lives. A blackened scroll, sealed with wax and written in words rather than ciphers, stands in stark contrast to the culture of concealment. It is an anomaly, suggesting either desperation, personal intent, or perhaps even betrayal of the system itself. Whoever wrote it, possibly the vanished commander, was willing to bypass centuries of protocol, leaving behind a physical trace that could survive when silence normally would. The duality of Spartan secrecy also extended to social hierarchy. Only a select few had access to the deepest truths of the state. While the Ephyrs managed civic law and the Gerousia deliberated on strategy, the Cryptia carried out acts that blurred the line between legality and survival. Helots, the enslaved population, were controlled not merely through brute force but through psychological domination. Random killings, intimidation, and surveillance created an atmosphere where fear was constant, and loyalty was enforced more by dread than by law. The scroll, in this context, suggests involvement at a level of command and knowledge far beyond what ordinary soldiers or citizens might suspect. Its existence hints at an event so sensitive that even the elite who drafted it could not leave it unprotected. The secrecy also shaped Spartan morality and identity. Loyalty was measured not just in combat skill but in discretion. Speaking of what one had seen, heard, or been ordered to do could be interpreted as treason. The vanished commander, then, was operating in a society that simultaneously demanded transparency of obedience and silence of insight. If he discovered something deeply destabilizing, there would have been no safe avenue to report it. Even trusted allies could become threats if knowledge leaked, and the hierarchy itself might punish those who threatened the illusion of Spartan perfection. By understanding this culture, the scroll begins to make sense as a historical anomaly. It was not merely a record of an order. It may have been a desperate attempt to communicate a truth that could not survive within the normal mechanisms of Sparta. Its presence in a hidden cave, its survival despite fire and decay, and its unusual form all point toward a society that valued secrecy above survival, a culture where knowledge itself could be dangerous, and where the vanishing of an entire unit could be orchestrated not by foreign enemies, but by the imperatives of the state. The mountain wilderness, where the commander disappeared, was as much a training ground for secrecy as it was a battlefield. The harsh terrain ensured that only those who could navigate it, survive it, and conceal themselves within it could function effectively. Every pass, every ravine, and every shadowed valley was a lesson in observation, discipline, and stealth. To outsiders, the landscape seemed uninhabitable. To Spartans, it was a canvas for controlled violence and hidden strategy. In this environment, secrecy was not a choice. It was a form of life, the currency of survival, and the foundation of Spartan power. As the scroll emerged centuries later, it forced historians and archaeologists to confront a paradox at the heart of Sparta. A civilization celebrated for its martial clarity, yet defined by its opacity. The very tools that made the city legendary, the disciplined army, the relentless agoge, the feared cryptia, also created blind spots, shadows where men could vanish, truths could be buried, and entire campaigns could be erased from history. The blackened scroll is not merely a relic. It is proof that in Sparta, the unseen could wield as much influence as the seen, and that sometimes, survival depended on bending the rules of silence itself. In this section of the story, the audience begins to feel the tension between what is known and what is hidden, between duty and fear, and between the public facade of Sparta and the private darkness that shaped its most secret operations. The culture of secrecy is not a backdrop. It is the key to understanding why a commander could disappear with 300 men, and why a black scroll could survive as the only witness to an event deliberately erased from memory. It is this invisible architecture of control, of shadows within shadows, that frames the mystery of the vanished commander and sets the stage for the revelations to come. The blackened scroll itself is a puzzle wrapped in fire and secrecy, an object so out of place in Spartan history that it immediately forces questions no historian had previously considered. Sparta, a civilization renowned for its strict codes, relied almost entirely on tactile, encrypted methods of communication. Commands were sent using the scytale, a rod around which narrow strips of leather were wrapped. Only someone possessing a rod of the exact same diameter could decipher the message. Every soldier trained for years to use this system, ensuring both speed and absolute secrecy. Scrolls, parchment, ink, these were materials for other Greek city-states, not for Sparta. And yet, here it is, a tightly rolled parchment, blackened at the edges by fire, sealed with wax, lying hidden in a mountain cave for centuries. The artifact defies the very principles of Spartan operational procedure, and this contradiction is what makes it so fascinating and dangerous. From the moment it was uncovered, the scroll suggested a breach, not just in communication, but in the core Spartan understanding of loyalty and order. Its wax seal bore the mark of a lambda, but unlike the precise imprints used for official orders, this emblem appeared hand-carved, irregular, almost hurried. Some scholars hypothesize that the commander himself wrote it, possibly in desperation, bypassing standard practice because there was no other way to preserve a message that could not survive within official channels. If true, the scroll represents not only a historical anomaly, but an act of rebellion, a conscious decision to defy the rigid methods of the state in order to preserve the truth. The scroll's very survival implies that someone, intentionally or accidentally, preserved it against the elements. Fire would have consumed most organic materials, and the humid mountain air is notoriously destructive. Yet the parchment remains largely intact, suggesting the use of protective measures that Sparta did not normally employ. Was it hidden with a ritualistic intention? Was it preserved as a warning, a confession, or a secret meant to be discovered only centuries later? These questions amplify the intrigue surrounding both the document and its vanished author. The words within, when partially translated, immediately suggest a level of urgency and complexity unheard of in typical Spartan communication. Where most orders are direct, attack at dawn, hold the pass, spare no one. This scroll contains phrases that read almost like cryptic warnings. The shadow approaches the altar at the third moon. It reads in one fragment, "Do not trust the hand that signs in fire." The diction is unlike that of any official Spartan command. Layered, symbolic, personal, and emotionally charged. Whoever wrote it was not merely issuing orders. They were trying to convey a nuanced truth, a moral or existential imperative, something that could not be compressed into a simple command. This anomaly raises disturbing possibilities. Could the commander have been acting outside the approval of the Ephors? Was he witnessing a conspiracy, a corruption within the very structure of Sparta itself? The scroll's language suggests awareness of forces operating beneath the visible surface of the city-state, forces that, if exposed, could destabilize the entire social and military order. That the document was hidden and partially burned reinforces the idea that whoever possessed it understood the peril of disclosure. The scroll also challenges the standard narrative of Spartan obedience. Spartans were trained to act without question, to suppress doubt in favor of duty. Yet this object implies doubt, fear, and moral hesitation. It hints at internal conflict within one of Sparta's most loyal officers, a man trained from childhood to obey implicitly, now questioning not only the mission he was sent on, but the city that sent him. The document is, in essence, the footprint of conscience, impossible to reconcile with the Spartan ideal of absolute obedience. For archaeologists and historians, the scroll is a revelation in multiple senses. It is both a historical object and a narrative device, pointing to events that official records ignored or deliberately erased. Its unusual existence compels a reevaluation of Spartan procedures and raises questions about the boundaries of secrecy, loyalty, and rebellion in one of history's most disciplined militaries. What kind of order could justify bypassing centuries of procedure? What secret could be so dangerous it required survival outside the standard methods of preservation? Ultimately, the Black Scroll is more than a relic. It is a window into the mind of a commander who faced impossible choices. Its survival suggests someone wanted the story to endure, but only partially, enough to intrigue, enough to warn, enough to unsettle future generations, but never enough to fully reveal the truth. It embodies the tension between official history and hidden realities, between order and conscience, and between a state that demanded absolute loyalty and an individual compelled to act in the shadow of its rigid laws. As the investigation into its contents deepens, the scroll becomes the first tangible link to a vanished campaign, a vanished unit, and a vanished commander. It is the spark that illuminates the darkness, the whisper from the past that dares to speak when all others remain silent. And it is here, in this contradiction, between form and function, obedience and conscience, survival and secrecy, that the true mystery begins to unfold. The mountains surrounding Laconia have always held a reputation for concealment, for hiding what the plains below could not bear to witness. Steep cliffs, jagged ravines, and dense forests create a labyrinth that is nearly impossible to traverse without intimate knowledge of the terrain. It was into these shadows that the Spartan commander and his 300 men disappeared. The records that remain are frustratingly vague, almost purposefully so. Ancient annals speak of a campaign that left no mark on official scrolls, no victory celebrated, no battle inscribed in stone. Only fleeting mentions survive, often contradictory, leaving historians grasping at fragments as though trying to reconstruct a face from shards of pottery. Some sources hint at an operation intended to suppress a Helot uprising in the remote valleys, while others suggest it was a mission to intercept a foreign incursion. But there is one detail that persists across every account. The commander and his men vanished without trace. The word used in later texts, apolithron, means more than lost. It implies deliberate erasure, a removal so complete it transcends mere death. To the Spartans, Disappearance was a statement as powerful as victory or defeat, signaling that the individual or unit had stepped outside the bounds of sanctioned action. Archaeological hints support this ambiguity. Small, temporary campsites were found in the passes of Taygetos, with fire pits and fragments of Spartan weapons, yet no signs of prolonged habitation or large-scale engagement. These traces suggest movement through the mountains rather than stationary encampments. Scholars interpret this to mean the mission was swift, surgical, and shrouded in secrecy, exactly the kind of operation that would leave no official record. Yet, the presence of burned artifacts and bones in hidden ravines complicates this interpretation, hinting at violence not formally acknowledged, perhaps even against Spartan citizens themselves. The Black Scroll itself provides the first concrete connection to this campaign. When translated, portions of its text reference locations that match the geography of these hidden valleys. The river that splits the twin cliffs, the cleft beneath the northern pass, the shadow of the third pine. These are not poetic flourishes, they are coordinates, a secret map encoded in words meant only for those who knew the terrain intimately. The scroll becomes more than an artifact. It is a key to understanding why this campaign was never mentioned in official annals. One of the most enigmatic lines reads, "Purification must come by night, unseen by those who would judge us." Historians have debated its meaning for decades. Was this a euphemism for a military strike? Or something darker? A ritualized action, perhaps directed at fellow Spartans who had overstepped some unseen law? The ambiguity itself is intentional, forcing the reader to wrestle with possibilities that range from tactical maneuvering to moral transgression. The scroll's phrasing suggests urgency, secrecy, and fear, qualities that align with a commander operating on the edge of Spartan law, aware that discovery could mean punishment or worse. Adding to the mystery is the timing. The campaign is thought to have occurred during a period of internal strife, when Helot revolts were becoming more frequent and political factions within the Ephorate were maneuvering for power. A mission like this, carried out in the mountains, could have served multiple purposes. Suppress unrest, gather intelligence, eliminate threats to the state, or enforce loyalty among the military elite. Yet whatever the goal, the result was unprecedented: total disappearance. No dispatches returned. No reports were filed. The commander, his men, and their mission were scrubbed from memory. The terrain itself may have contributed to this erasure. Taygetos is unforgiving. Narrow passes, sudden drop-offs, hidden caves, and sudden weather changes make navigation treacherous even for seasoned warriors. A deliberate disappearance here could have been executed with precision, ensuring that no outsider, and no Spartan citizen unapproved to witness, could follow. This creates a chilling thought. The mountains themselves became allies in secrecy, shielding actions that were too dangerous, too controversial, or too morally complex to ever be exposed. Oral traditions among nearby villages, though recorded centuries later, suggest glimpses of the lost men. Shepherds spoke of columns of warriors moving silently at night, vanishing when approached, leaving behind only the echo of disciplined footsteps and the faint smell of burnt wood. Hunters claimed to see smoke from hidden fires, yet no one dared investigate. To the locals, these were ghosts, but in reality, they could have been remnants of a campaign carefully designed to erase its own evidence. The missing commander's own decisions may have amplified the mystery. The scroll hints at a reluctance to follow orders blindly, suggesting that he may have diverged from the original mission to act according to his conscience. If true, this could explain both the disappearance and the unusual phrasing of the document. It was no longer merely a military operation. It was a moral crossroads, an event where loyalty, fear, and duty collided in the shadows. By the end of this section, the campaign is no longer just a footnote in history. It is a living enigma. The mountains, the lost men, and the Black Scroll converge into a puzzle that has persisted for centuries. Every discovery raises new questions. Why were these orders so secretive? Why did the commander choose, or was forced, to vanish with his men? And above all, what is the meaning behind purification by night? A phrase that resonates with both Spartan ritual and the unspoken darkness at the heart of the city-state itself. It is here, in these hidden valleys and cryptic phrases, that the true mystery of the vanished commander begins to unfold. The audience is left with a sense of awe and unease, a question dangling in the air. If an entire unit can disappear without trace, what other secrets lie buried in the shadows of Sparta, waiting to be uncovered? The forbidden chamber lay deep within the cliffs, hidden behind a maze of narrow corridors and uneven stone steps carved centuries before the oracle's arrival. To the untrained eye, it appeared as nothing more than a natural cave, its walls jagged and dripping with condensation. But those entrusted with the oracle's care knew better. The chamber had been deliberately designed to conceal, to protect, and to inspire fear in anyone who dared to approach without permission. Torches flickered against the rough rock, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to twist into shapes of long-forgotten guardians, their faces frozen in eternal watchfulness. Every surface bore a faint pattern of carvings, geometric designs interlaced with celestial symbols, star charts so precise that only the most learned astronomers could recognize them. Descending into the chamber was like stepping into another world. The air was cool and dense, carrying a metallic tang that hinted at the bronze oracle's presence even before it came into view. The floor, uneven with natural rock, had been partially leveled to create narrow paths leading to the pedestal where the machine would ultimately rest. Water seeped through cracks in the ceiling, dripping rhythmically into shallow pools that reflected the faint light, giving the impression of an underground sky. Priests who had spent their entire lives guarding the oracle whispered that the chamber itself was alive, not with consciousness, but with purpose, a deliberate design to separate the sacred from the profane. The deeper one ventured, the more unsettling the space became. Bronze plates embedded into the walls caught torchlight and reflected it in strange, angular patterns, making the chamber feel both vast and disorienting. Staircases spiraled downward in ways that seemed mathematically impossible, their angles and proportions precise enough to suggest that whoever had built this place understood geometry far beyond the knowledge of contemporary civilizations. Along the walls, intricate engravings depicted mechanical diagrams interwoven with astronomical charts. The images were almost hypnotic, forcing observers to pause and decipher them, though none could fully comprehend their meaning. Some patterns suggested movements of the oracle's inner gears. Others hinted at alignments of stars centuries before any telescope existed. Every object in the chamber seemed deliberate, yet incomprehensible. Small niches held fragments of bronze, tiny, gear-like components that might have been part of the oracle or prototypes of it. Some stones were inlaid with magnetic ores, arranged in patterns that suggested the manipulation of unseen forces. Priests whispered about these objects as if speaking of living creatures. "Do not touch," they would say. "Even the smallest piece carries its own intent." Many who observed these details reported a sensation of being watched, though no living eye was present. The very architecture, the angles of light and shadow, and the hum of moisture in the air seemed to conspire together to create a sense that the chamber itself was sentient. The pedestal at the center of the chamber was the ultimate focal point. Carved from a single block of stone, its surface was polished and engraved with star maps, numerical sequences, and cryptic warnings. When the oracle was placed upon it, the device aligned perfectly with these markings, as if the chamber and the machine were two halves of a single, incomprehensible mechanism. Lightning from storms above, filtered through narrow fissures, would occasionally illuminate the pedestal, casting reflections across the room that resembled moving gears. The effect was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, creating an aura of sanctity and terror that reinforced the oracle's power even before it was activated. It was here, in the forbidden chamber, that the oracle truly revealed its presence. Even when silent, its bronze plates and gears seemed to hum with potential energy, waiting for the moment when the priests would seek its counsel. Shadows danced across its surface, and light played against its intricate mechanisms, making it seem almost alive. Observers often reported a sensation of anticipatory tension, as if the machine knew they were there and judged them for their intentions. Those with impure motives or excessive curiosity found the experience overwhelming, sometimes leaving the chamber with unexplained illness or sudden fainting. The chamber's design was more than practical. It was symbolic. Every step, every carved wall, every reflective surface served as a test of discipline, reverence, and understanding. Only those who approached with humility could navigate its depths without disturbance. The priest's warnings were not merely superstition, they were survival guidelines. Misstep, misinterpretation, or impatience could provoke outcomes that the human mind could not comprehend. And yet, even those trained for years to guard and interpret the oracle admitted that no preparation could truly convey the chamber's full weight. It was a place where history, technology, and the divine seemed to merge, leaving those who entered both awestruck and unnervingly small. As centuries passed, the forbidden chamber itself became part of the oracle's legend. Even those who had never seen it spoke of the hollow echo of dripping water, the flicker of torchlight on bronze, and the overwhelming precision of its design. Travelers and scholars who stumbled upon the outer passages were driven back by instinctive fear, convinced that the space was protected by some unseen power. Stories of strange geometries, moving shadows, and the metallic hum of the oracle itself circulated quietly, reinforcing the notion that this was no ordinary artifact. The chamber was not just a home for the machine. It was a statement of intent, a silent guardian, and a testament to a civilization capable of crafting both awe and terror in bronze, stone, and shadow. Within this chamber, the oracle waited, impervious to human ambition, silent yet commanding. Those who entered its depths sensed an order far greater than themselves, a rhythm that operated on a scale they could barely perceive. And as the centuries wore on, the chamber, like the oracle itself, remained untouched by time, a hidden world of geometry, metal, and mystery, where the fate of empires was quietly observed and perhaps even guided. Sparta's strength was forged in the crucible of discipline and war, but its internal life was far from harmonious. Beneath the rigid exterior of phalanxes and ceremonial drills, the city simmered with tensions that few outsiders ever glimpsed. The late classical period was particularly fraught, marked by a convergence of political friction, social unrest, and economic strain. The city that prided itself on order and obedience was, in truth, a society balancing on a knife's edge, where a single misstep could threaten everything. Understanding this internal turbulence is crucial to comprehending why a commander and 300 men could vanish without explanation, and why the black scroll that emerged centuries later carries such weight. At the top of the hierarchy, the ephors wielded immense power, overseeing civic law, military policy, and even moral conduct. But they were not a monolith. Personal ambition, rivalry, and factionalism shaped their decisions. Conflicts among the ephors often spilled into the military ranks, creating subtle rifts in authority that could escalate quickly. One faction might favor aggressive action against helot uprisings, while another advocated caution, fearing the destabilization of Sparta's fragile social balance. In such an environment, a commander operating in the field could find himself caught between contradictory orders, forced to navigate loyalties that shifted with the political wind. Even among the military elite, tensions ran deep. Spartan warriors were trained to value unity above all else, yet human nature could not be entirely suppressed. Personal rivalries, envy over promotion, and resentment toward favored comrades created undercurrents that threatened cohesion. The vanished commander, described in fragments as both capable and principled, would have had to maintain the allegiance of his 300 men while contending with these hidden frictions. Maintaining discipline under ordinary circumstances was difficult enough. In the mountains, removed from the watchful eyes of Sparta itself, the task became nearly impossible. Beneath the city, the helots, the enslaved population of Messenia, were quietly fomenting resistance. While Sparta's propaganda painted a picture of absolute control, the reality was that helots outnumbered Spartans by a significant margin. Periodic revolts, subtle sabotage, and fleeing serfs were constant threats that could never be fully eradicated. Spartan policy toward helots was brutal and strategic. Terror and violence were employed as both punishment and warning. The Cryptia ensured surveillance and enforced discipline, but it was an imperfect system, leaving gaps that a savvy enemy or a conscientious commander could exploit. The Black Scroll hints at a mission that intersected with these internal dangers, suggesting that the vanished commander may have encountered threats not only from geography and enemies, but from the very population he was tasked with controlling. Economic stress further complicated Spartan stability. The city relied heavily on the labor of helots and the tribute of allied states to sustain its citizens, especially its warrior class. Crop failures, uneven distribution of resources, and political corruption placed pressure on both the leadership and the citizenry. A commander operating under these conditions would have been acutely aware of the stakes, not just strategic or military, but social, economic, and moral. The scroll's instructions, cryptic though they are, may reflect a need to navigate these pressures with caution, indicating that the mission's failure or success could reverberate far beyond the immediate battlefield. This period also saw the emergence of subtle ideological conflicts. Sparta's rigid adherence to Lycurgan principles, the laws and customs attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, was increasingly challenged by pragmatic concerns. Some leaders argued for adaptation and innovation. Others insisted on absolute conformity. The vanished commander may have found himself caught between these conflicting philosophies, expected to follow orders while reconciling them with a personal code of ethics. The Black Scroll's careful language, its moral undertones, and its unusual format suggest a man grappling with questions larger than mere strategy. Loyalty versus conscience, obedience versus justice, secrecy versus truth. The combination of political factionalism, internal military tensions, helot unrest, economic strain, and ideological conflict created an environment of constant, often invisible danger. Sparta was not a city at peace. It was a city at war with itself, a living organism in which ambition, fear, and loyalty coexisted in precarious balance. It is within this charged atmosphere that the vanished commander operated, tasked with a mission that may have required him to confront both external and internal threats, and forced to navigate a labyrinth of loyalty, deception, and peril that extended far beyond the battlefield. When the Black Scroll is examined in this context, its significance deepens. It becomes more than a mysterious artifact. It is a window into the pressures and dangers of a society that demanded perfection yet allowed little room for deviation. A society where a commander could disappear with 300 men and the state could quietly erase all evidence. The scroll's cryptic directives, its moral weight, and its survival against centuries of fire and decay reveal a world in which secrecy was not just a tactic, but a survival mechanism, and in which the vanishing of men, the erasure of names, and the burial of truth were all instruments wielded to preserve an image of unity. As the audience begins to understand the city at war with itself, they can see why the mountains became a place of both refuge and danger, why orders written on a blackened scroll could be more powerful than any sword, and why a commander's conscience might compel him to act in ways that history would choose to forget. The internal turmoil of Sparta sets the stage for a story of vanished men, hidden orders, and a civilization where loyalty and secrecy were inextricably intertwined, creating a shadow that would endure for centuries. The march into the mountains was not just a physical journey. It was a passage into an entirely different world, one that challenged every assumption the Spartan soldiers had ever held. Below, Sparta's rigid streets, sun-baked training grounds, and ceremonial squares had their order, their predictability, their rules. But in the Taygetos range, chaos was embedded into the landscape itself. Jagged peaks rose like the spines of some primordial creature, narrow passes threatened sudden death, and forests so dense that daylight barely penetrated created an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. Every step, every footfall, carried risk, not merely from natural hazards, but from the possibility of unseen enemies lurking in shadows, ready to strike. The commander's 300 men were not ordinary soldiers. They were among Sparta's finest, hand-picked for endurance, loyalty, and strategic acumen. Yet even they felt the mountain's oppressive weight. Rocks slid beneath boots, roots twisted like serpents across narrow trails, and sudden storms could wash away paths in minutes. The environment itself became an adversary, shaping their movements, their strategy, and their psychology. The army that had never failed in the structured discipline of city and plain now faced the uncertainty of terrain that neither maps nor experience could fully tame. From the very beginning, the march tested their cohesion. The commander, whose strategic mind had already proven exceptional in prior campaigns, had to manage not only navigation and survival, but the mental state of his men. Fatigue, fear, and the ever-present tension of secrecy weighed heavily. Silence was enforced not only as a tactic but as a moral imperative. Every conversation, every unnecessary sound, increased the risk of detection. By day, they moved slowly, careful to conceal tracks and avoid open ridges. By night, the soldiers learned to communicate with gestures, shadows, and the subtle rustle of movement, relying on instincts honed from years of agoged training. It is within these mountains that the psychological dimensions of Spartan training become clear. Soldiers were taught to suppress fear, yet here, fear was both unavoidable and necessary. It sharpened attention, reinforced vigilance, and ensured that obedience became instinct rather than thought. Yet the scroll suggests that even the most disciplined men were not immune to doubt. Lines such as, "Trust the shadow, not the hand that feeds it," hint at internal conflict, perhaps disagreements over orders, or a growing awareness that the mission might not align entirely with Spartan law or morality. The mountains, then, were not merely a physical battlefield, they were a crucible of conscience. The environment also imposed strategic considerations. Narrow passes meant that any ambush could be catastrophic. Hidden ravines offered potential concealment for both enemies and allies. Swift rivers cut across their path, necessitating careful planning and coordination. The commander's decisions here reveal his mastery. Every detour, every choice of camping location, every moment of forced silence reflected an acute understanding of terrain as both weapon and shield. It is possible, as some scholars argue, that the mountains themselves were deliberately chosen by the ephors for this campaign, a place where success or failure could be controlled by knowledge and discipline as much as by brute force. But the mountains held secrets beyond geography. Ancient groves, hidden caves, and natural rock formations offered not just shelter, but also the potential for concealment from both Spartan authorities and enemies alike. The vanished commander may have understood that the mission required not only physical navigation but also mastery over perception. To be unseen in the mountains was to exist in multiple layers of reality simultaneously, visible to comrades who understood the terrain, invisible to those who sought to track or punish. In this context, the scroll's cryptic language, "Move where the wind whispers, and let stone be your ally," takes on practical as well as symbolic meaning. The environment exacted a psychological toll that cannot be underestimated. Sleep was scarce, food often limited, and exposure to elements constant. The men were trained to endure, but endurance has limits. Morale, trust, and even loyalty were tested in these conditions, particularly if the mission itself contained elements of moral ambiguity. A soldier's obedience is easier to maintain when the purpose is clear. When the purpose is uncertain, when the orders are secretive to the point of alienation, the mountains magnify every doubt, every hesitation. The scroll hints at such tensions, suggesting that the commander faced not only the landscape but the inner terrain of human conscience and fear. As the march progressed, the men began leaving subtle signs, deliberate markers on rocks, small cairns, scratches on bark, indicating both routes taken and potential safe havens. These marks were impermanent, designed to be readable only by those trained to interpret them. They were echoes of the Cryptia's lessons, transposed onto a larger, more dangerous stage. Every decision in the mountains carried weight. Misstep could mean exposure, moral compromise, or death. By the time they reached the central valleys, the narrative of the mission becomes fragmented, but the evidence suggests a combination of strategic positioning and deliberate concealment. Camps were temporary, fires extinguished to leave no trace, and movement was constant. Whatever the objective, the mission's execution required an extraordinary blend of discipline, skill, and psychological resilience. It is here, in the relentless, shadowed mountains, that the vanished commander and his men fully stepped out of history's visible record, existing instead in the domain of speculation, legend, and hidden evidence, until the Black Scroll emerged centuries later, bridging the silence with cryptic instructions, fragmented observations, and a whisper of conscience left behind in the folds of scorched parchment. The mountains are both witness and participant in this story, shaping events, erasing traces, and framing a disappearance that has haunted historians ever since. The combination of terrain, secrecy, and human endurance transformed a simple march into a multidimensional operation where survival depended on obedience, moral judgment, and mastery over a landscape that seemed intent on swallowing intruders whole. And it is this convergence of geography, discipline, and shadow that turns a military campaign into a story of vanished men, hidden truths, and enduring mystery, setting the stage for revelations that the Black Scroll only begins to hint at. The first signs of trouble appeared subtly, almost imperceptibly. At the outset, the commander and his 300 men moved with Spartan precision, every soldier performing his role with the discipline instilled from childhood. Tracks were carefully concealed, fires kept low, and scouts sent ahead to survey each ravine and pass. The mountains themselves were both obstacle and ally, a treacherous labyrinth that could hide a single man or an entire unit if navigated with skill. Yet as days passed, small anomalies began to unsettle the men, whispering that the mission was not proceeding as intended. Paths that should have been clear were blocked by landslides, previously mapped streams had swelled into impassable torrents, and at night, unfamiliar sounds echoed through the valleys, low howls, the snapping of branches, and distant, rhythmic drumming that seemed too deliberate to be the work of animals. The scroll, although written with careful precision, hints at these mounting tensions. Phrases such as "the wind carries more than smoke," and "even the shadow betrays those who do not listen," suggest that the commander was aware of both external threats and internal vulnerabilities. He was not merely navigating terrain. He was navigating uncertainty, aware that the mountains might conceal enemies, spies, or even betrayal within his own ranks. The meticulous organization of the unit was being tested against an environment and circumstances that no training could fully prepare them for. Morale began to fray as the men confronted the psychological weight of isolation. Spartan soldiers were taught to endure hardship, yet there is a difference between controlled adversity during training and the unrelenting unpredictability of the Teajido's range. Nights were long and cold, rations dwindled, and the sense of being watched or pursued grew into a tangible anxiety. Some soldiers reported seeing figures moving at the edges of campfires, disappearing before they could be identified. Others described dreams in which the mountains themselves seemed alive, shifting paths and cliffs, mocking their careful preparations. It was as if the landscape had become sentient, aware of their presence, and intent on testing their resolve. The commander, however, remained a figure of steadiness amid the creeping tension. His leadership was not only tactical but psychological. He disciplined those whose fear threatened to unravel order, encouraged vigilance, and reminded men of their duty to Sparta and to each other. Yet the scroll's tone suggests he was quietly battling his own doubts. Lines referencing unseen eyes and the weight of decisions imply that he recognized the moral complexity of their mission. The objective, whatever it was, might not have been as clear-cut as it appeared on the surface. He faced the possibility that following orders exactly could have consequences he could not morally accept. As the unit pushed deeper into the mountains, contact with the outside world became impossible. No messages returned, no signals were sent, and the terrain itself seemed to sever all links to Sparta. The combination of isolation, environmental hazards, and moral uncertainty created a pressure cooker atmosphere. Soldiers trained to obey without question were confronted with the profound ambiguity of their orders. Should they act on instinct, adhering strictly to Spartan doctrine, or interpret the instructions through the lens of conscience and survival? The scroll's cryptic phrases suggest the latter, hinting at the commander's awareness that the mission demanded judgment beyond rote obedience. Small incidents escalated the tension further. Scouts returning from recon reported signs of other movements, trampled undergrowth, faint tracks that did not match Spartan footwear, and evidence of hastily abandoned fires. The mountains, already treacherous, now seemed populated with unknown forces. Were these local insurgents, foreign agents, or perhaps factions of helots seeking revenge? The ambiguity intensified fear and mistrust within the unit, testing loyalty and cohesion at a level few could endure. Every decision carried stakes that were both immediate life and death, and existential, threatening the integrity of the men's discipline, honor, and moral framework. Physical exhaustion compounded psychological strain. Soldiers marched for days with minimal rest, often over broken terrain with heavy equipment. Cold rain seeped through tunics, soaking both men and their leather gear. Rations were rationed further than usual, forcing men to forage from the sparse alpine vegetation or rely on hidden stores that may have been prearranged. The scroll suggests this scarcity was intentional in part, designed to sharpen minds and bodies while emphasizing the necessity of stealth and vigilance. Yet even the most disciplined soldiers began to show signs of strain, missteps, hesitation, and questioning of orders, all dangerous in a mission where absolute cohesion was essential. Amid this growing tension, the commander's decisions became increasingly crucial. The scroll emphasizes observation and subtlety. Move like the river, unseen and unstoppable. It reads in one fragment. Such instructions indicate a strategic awareness that extended beyond standard military tactics. Survival depended not merely on brute force but on interpreting signs, reading the environment, and anticipating threats both natural and human. The mountains were teaching lessons in humility, patience, and moral discernment, lessons that could not be acquired in the city or training grounds. By the time the unit approached the central passes, the combination of isolation, environmental challenges, and subtle psychological pressures had created a situation where conventional leadership and standard operating procedures were insufficient. The commander's reliance on judgment, adaptability, and an acute understanding of human nature became critical. The scroll hints that these pressures may have contributed to the decision to deviate from the original mission or, at least, to interpret it in ways that diverged from the effort's expectations. Section 9 closes with a sense of mounting suspense and foreboding. The mountains, relentless and enigmatic, have become a crucible where the vanished commander's men are tested in body, mind, and spirit. Every step they take deepens the mystery of their disappearance, and the Black Scroll serves as both guide and warning, hinting at dangers unseen, decisions unmade, and the complex interplay of duty, conscience, and survival. It is here, in this shadowed labyrinth of cliffs and forests, that history begins to dissolve, leaving only fragments, whispers, and the first real suggestion that the mission may not have ended as anyone expected. The first encounter that shattered the rhythm of the march occurred in the shadow of a narrow ravine, a place where sunlight barely touched the moss-covered rocks and the air hung thick with the scent of damp earth. The commander's scouts had reported nothing unusual, yet as the main unit approached, an unnerving stillness descended. Birds ceased their calls. The wind died to a mere whisper. Even the river that normally roared through the valley seemed to pause, as if the landscape itself held its breath. The soldiers, trained for decades to read signs of danger, felt the tension immediately, a silent alarm that prickled at the base of their necks. According to fragments of the Black Scroll, the commander had anticipated such moments, yet the language used suggests that even he could not fully predict what lay ahead. Trust not the echo of your own footsteps. One line reads, an instruction that carries both tactical and psychological weight. The mountains, familiar yet unknowable, had begun to exert their own will over the men. Every rock, every shadow, seemed a potential threat. Every movement required hesitation, assessment, and instinctive decision-making. The balance between maintaining stealth and ensuring progress became perilously thin. Then came the first tangible sign of another presence. Faint footprints pressed into mud along a narrow trail, irregular and hurried. They did not match the disciplined tread of Spartan soldiers. They were lighter, perhaps those of a single person or a small group, but enough to suggest that the unit was being observed. The commander ordered immediate concealment, signaling the men to melt into the shadows, to use the terrain as a cloak. Rocks and fallen trees became shields. The soldiers' training in silence, patience, and patience under pressure was put to the ultimate test. This encounter marks the moment when the mission shifted from routine reconnaissance or enforcement to something far more enigmatic. The scroll's instructions become almost philosophical in nature. The shadow follows those who believe themselves alone. Move not as men, but as whispers of wind. These words indicate that the commander was confronting not just a physical obstacle, but a moral and existential one. The mountains were not simply a battlefield. They were an arena in which fear, trust, and perception intertwined. Every decision had immediate tactical consequences, yet each was imbued with an almost metaphysical weight, the weight of choices whose ramifications might ripple far beyond the moment. As night fell, the commander ordered a temporary halt in a hidden grove, the kind of natural alcove that could shelter the entire unit while remaining invisible from the surrounding ridges. Fires were minimized, smoke funneled through narrow chimneys formed by rock, and scouts rotated positions to ensure constant vigilance. Despite the extreme caution, anxiety rippled through the men. Whispers circulated, unheard by the commander, perhaps deliberately so, about strange occurrences. Shadows that moved independently of natural light, the faint scent of burning herbs without fire, and the sensation of being watched from every angle. The scroll does not merely guide. It seems to acknowledge these fears, offering cryptic counsel meant to align instinct with reason. The psychological toll was profound. The Spartan ideal was predicated on discipline, courage, and obedience. Yet here the soldiers confronted the limits of all three. Physical conditioning could carry them over cliffs and through snow, but it could not inoculate them against the gnawing uncertainty of unseen forces. Fatigue, hunger, and the cold compounded mental strain, blurring lines between imagination, threat, and reality. The scroll's advice, practical, coded, and almost meditative, served as a tether, anchoring them to a framework that was at once tactical and ethical. The next day brought a new layer of complication. As the unit descended into a concealed valley, they discovered remnants of what appeared to be a camp, hastily abandoned. Fires were cold, provisions scattered, and impressions in the soil indicated a presence of unknown origin. The commander examined the site meticulously, noting patterns in the debris, possible escape routes, and points of vulnerability. The scroll's guidance here is precise. Read the land as it would read you. Assume it holds secrets, and act as if it breathes with intent. This passage underscores the duality of their environment. The mountains were both ally and adversary, capable of concealing and revealing in equal measure. Tension escalated further when scouts reported distant drumming, rhythmic yet irregular. Could it be local insurgents, helots seeking revenge, or something more deliberate, almost ritualistic? The commander, experienced yet human, hesitated before issuing the next command. Each order had to account for terrain, troop morale, and the unseen intelligence embedded in the scroll's cryptic passages. This was no longer a conventional military operation. It had evolved into a psychological labyrinth, in which observation, intuition, and disciplined fear dictated survival as much as spear or shield. By the evening of the second day, the unit had grown more wary, more attuned to the subtle cues in the environment. The men moved with heightened awareness, reading the interplay of light and shadow, the direction of wind and water, and the rhythm of their own breathing. The mountains had become a living entity, an active participant in the unfolding narrative. The commander's leadership was not simply a matter of issuing orders. It was about translating the mountain's hidden language into actions that preserved life, purpose, and moral integrity. Section 10 concludes with the sense that the mission has crossed a threshold. No longer merely a deployment of soldiers on a secretive operation, it has become an immersive test of human perception, resilience, and conscience. The Black Scroll remains the linchpin, offering guidance, warning, and moral reflection, but never absolving the men of the responsibility for their choices. Here, the mountains are more than a stage. They are an active force shaping the course of events, an unforgiving arena where strategy, morality, and survival collide in ways that leave historians and audiences alike grappling with the profound enigma of the vanished commander. The discovery of the hidden ravine marked the beginning of a sequence of events that would come to define the mission's enigma. The area was concealed from any standard vantage point, shielded by sheer cliffs on either side, twisted pine roots, and a canopy so dense that daylight barely penetrated to the forest floor. Here, the commander chose to establish a temporary base, a strategic decision that balanced concealment with access to vital resources. A freshwater stream, dry patches for fires, and vantage points from which to monitor approaching threats. Every detail of the site selection reflects the mind of a commander acutely aware of both the terrain and the fragile psychological state of his men. From fragments of the Black Scroll, we understand that the commander instructed his soldiers to move silently, to minimize footprints, and to conceal any evidence of habitation. Lines such as "Let stone remember, not men" suggest an almost ritualistic approach to maintaining secrecy. In Spartan culture, the idea of leaving no trace was not merely practical. It was a moral imperative, ensuring that the mission could neither be compromised nor judged by those who might misinterpret actions taken under duress. In this isolated environment, the men were forced to confront the tension between obedience, survival, and the emerging sense that their mission carried moral ambiguities. The soldiers' routines in the ravine were designed to maintain operational effectiveness while reinforcing discipline under extreme isolation. Watches were set in overlapping shifts, requiring constant vigilance even in darkness. Rations were meticulously divided, with foraging undertaken only when absolutely necessary to preserve stealth. The scroll provides coded instructions regarding these movements. Step where the river's reflection does not meet your gaze. Eat what the earth offers quietly, as if unseen. Such phrasing implies a psychological layer to the operation. The men were not only learning to survive physically, but to adapt to an environment where perception itself could betray or protect them. Conflict, both internal and external, began to surface as days passed. Some soldiers questioned the purpose of certain orders or the interpretation of the scroll's cryptic phrases. The commander, while maintaining authority, encouraged critical thinking within strict boundaries. This was a delicate balance. Spartan training emphasized unquestioning obedience, yet the mission demanded adaptive judgment. The scroll appears to have served as a moral and strategic anchor, providing guidance that neither removed responsibility nor simplified the complexity of decisions. It is during this period that the first real indications of external observation emerged. Scouts reported faint signs of other movement in the surrounding cliffs, footprints of unknown origin, disturbances in undergrowth, and the occasional flicker of a distant firelight. Each observation heightened the sense of unease and reinforced the importance of the commander's meticulous planning. The mountains were no longer merely obstacles. They had become a theater for a multi-layered interaction between men, terrain, and unseen forces. The soldiers had to assume that every shadow could conceal danger, that every gust of wind might carry a warning, and that the mission itself had ramifications extending far beyond immediate survival. The psychological strain of this environment cannot be overstated. Soldiers trained for decades to endure hardship were now confronted with a relentless, almost sentient landscape. Darkness was absolute, broken only by occasional fire or moonlight, and the sounds of the forest became both ally and enemy. Each footfall, each rustle of leaves, became a potential signal of threat or betrayal. The scroll's language, symbolic, cautionary, and prescriptive, was vital to maintaining cohesion, providing a framework in which men could interpret the world around them and act decisively despite fear. One particularly chilling aspect recorded in the scroll involves instructions about the handling of captured insurgents or spies. The text suggests discretion so extreme that even the soldiers themselves might not know the full details of actions taken by their comrades. Let the mountain hold the guilty, but let your conscience be weighed in silence. This duality, enforcing Spartan law while acknowledging moral uncertainty, underscores the unprecedented nature of the mission. The commander and his men were operating in a space that defied conventional morality, where obedience, survival, and conscience were in constant tension. By the fourth day in the ravine, reports of strange phenomena began circulating among the soldiers. They described unidentifiable tracks, eerie echoes, and the sensation that the environment itself was watching them. These observations, while unsettling, were never officially documented, leaving only the scroll and oral fragments passed down centuries later as evidence. The commander's response, according to the scroll, was measured and calm. He emphasized observation, patience, and restraint, reinforcing the principle that understanding one's environment was as crucial as physical skill or discipline. The ravine also became a site of reflection for the men. Away from the rigid hierarchy and public scrutiny of Sparta, they were confronted with the implications of their mission. Was this strictly a tactical operation, or had they entered a morally ambiguous space in which obedience might conflict with conscience? The scroll's cryptic advice, phrases invoking shadows, wind, and silence, appears to have functioned as both guide and meditation, reminding soldiers to act decisively while contemplating the broader consequences of their choices. Section 11 closes with a growing awareness that the mountains, the Black Scroll, and the vanished commander's unit had entered a domain beyond ordinary military engagement. The ravine, at once sanctuary and crucible, tested the soldiers physically, psychologically, and morally. Every choice, every movement, and every observation carried significance far beyond the immediate mission. It was here that the first hints of what would become the enduring mystery of their disappearance emerged, framed by the tension between Spartan discipline, environmental challenge, and the shadowed instructions of a commander who seemed to navigate both terrain and conscience with extraordinary acuity. The deeper the unit pressed into the mountains, the more the environment seemed to take on a character of its own. Valleys narrowed into jagged corridors where sunlight rarely touched the forest floor, and the air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, carried sounds that could be easily misinterpreted. Every rustle of leaves, every distant call of an animal, every shifting shadow became a potential signal, either warning of danger or a test of vigilance. The commander's 300 men, trained for decades in the rigid disciplines of Sparta, now faced challenges that no drill could adequately prepare them for. They were no longer merely soldiers executing a mission. They had become observers, analysts, and participants in a landscape that seemed almost alive with intent. The Black Scroll's instructions became increasingly central to their survival. Lines such as "move as if the mountains themselves conceal you," or "trust the silence more than the voice of men," illustrate a philosophy that merged tactical skill with psychological attunement. The commander appears to have interpreted these directives with extraordinary precision, orchestrating movements that balance speed, stealth, and moral discernment. Yet even he could not fully anticipate the complexity of the terrain, the behavior of his men under prolonged isolation, or the subtle signs of external threats. Each decision required judgment that went beyond conventional Spartan training, an integration of instinct, experience, and an understanding of human nature. By the 7th day of the campaign, signs of strain were evident. Physical fatigue had set in, compounded by limited rations and harsh weather. Cold nights left men shivering despite their cloaks, and sporadic rain made the treacherous paths even more hazardous. But it was the psychological stress that proved most insidious. The soldiers, trained to suppress fear and doubt, began to question not only the mission but their own perceptions. Faint noises in the darkness became potential enemies. Shadows lengthened into imagined threats. The mountains themselves seemed to close in, magnifying the isolation and heightening anxiety. The scroll's cryptic language offered guidance but also demanded interpretation, leaving the commander and his men in a constant state of cautious vigilance. External threats began to manifest in more tangible ways. Scouts reported the occasional footprint, the evidence of fires hastily extinguished, and other signs suggesting that the unit was being observed. Yet the source of these intrusions remained elusive. Were they local insurgents, helots seeking revenge, or rival Spartan factions monitoring the operation? The ambiguity intensified fear and forced the commander to balance defensive caution with the need to maintain forward momentum. Every tactical decision carried moral weight, as deviation from orders could save lives or, conversely, compromise the mission entirely. The mountain's natural features both aided and hindered the men. Narrow ridges offered concealment but limited maneuverability. Steep cliffs provided vantage points for observation but exposed soldiers to the risk of falls. Hidden caves could serve as shelter, yet they might also harbor unknown dangers. The commander leveraged these features with skill, often deploying scouts to test the safety of routes and instructing men on subtle movements to avoid detection. The scroll's phrasing, almost poetic in its precision, provided a cognitive framework, reminding soldiers that survival depended on both physical skill and psychological attunement. Morale remained a constant concern. Even the most disciplined Spartans were vulnerable to the compounded effects of isolation, fear, and the moral ambiguity of their task. Rumors began to circulate within the unit, Stories of figures glimpsed from afar, of sounds too deliberate to be natural, of fleeting lights in the distance. Some men began to question the mission's ultimate objective, while others feared the consequences of failure or misjudgment. The commander's ability to maintain cohesion under these conditions underscores both his strategic acumen and the extraordinary pressures imposed by the environment. The scroll itself hints at deeper complexities within the mission. One line reads, "Let conscience guide what law cannot dictate." This suggests that the commander may have been tasked with a mission that required judgment beyond the black-and-white framework of Spartan law. The ambiguity of orders, combined with the isolation of the mountains, placed him and his men in a moral crucible, forcing choices that could have far-reaching implications. It is possible that these pressures contributed to the eventual decision to disappear, a move that would protect both the unit and the secrets they carried from scrutiny or reprisal. Supply lines, normally the backbone of any campaign, were non-existent in this terrain. The men relied entirely on carried rations, natural resources, and prearranged caches indicated in the scroll. Every meal, every rest stop, every navigation decision became a test of judgment and adaptability. Mistakes were potentially fatal, whether from environmental hazards, hostile observation, or internal discord. The mountains had transformed into both mentor and adversary, teaching lessons in humility, patience, and vigilance that could not be replicated in Spartan training grounds. By the 10th day, the commander had established a rhythm of movement and observation that maximized safety while minimizing detection. The men were learning to read the mountains as an extension of themselves, interpreting subtle cues in wind, water, and shadow. Yet despite this growing mastery, the unit remained vulnerable to forces beyond their comprehension. Moral ambiguity, unseen observers, and the inexorable pressure of isolation. The Black Scroll's cryptic guidance continued to serve as both tactical manual and philosophical counsel, reminding soldiers that survival required more than skill. It required insight, restraint, and ethical judgment. Section 12 closes with a mounting sense of suspense. The unit has become deeply enmeshed in the mountains, navigating challenges that are at once physical, psychological, and moral. The landscape is no longer a backdrop. It is a participant, shaping decisions, testing discipline, and amplifying fear. The Black Scroll remains the linchpin of the operation, guiding action while leaving room for interpretation. And as the men move deeper into this shadowed terrain, the mystery of their eventual disappearance grows, hinting at a convergence of factors: terrain, secrecy, human endurance, and moral ambiguity that will define the story for centuries to come. The tension reached a new height as the commander and his men ventured into the upper ridges, a zone where the mountains became unforgiving in both terrain and psychological impact. Here, sheer cliffs dropped abruptly into hidden valleys, while jagged outcrops created natural choke points, perfect for ambushes or concealment. The wind screamed through narrow gaps, carrying voices, animal calls, and sometimes unidentifiable sounds that seemed to mock the soldiers' vigilance. In these ridges, the Spartan discipline that had served them so well in city squares and training grounds faced its greatest trial. A combination of physical danger, isolation, and the persistent uncertainty that the mission's purpose was still shrouded in secrecy. The Black Scroll, more than a guide, had become a philosophical anchor. Lines such as "the stone is your friend," "the shadow your ally," were no longer abstract instructions, but concrete strategies for survival. Every movement was deliberate, every position selected with meticulous care to exploit natural cover and minimize exposure. The soldiers learned to navigate the ridges with a silent grace, communicating through subtle signals, foot placement, and the tilt of a head. The mountains themselves dictated the pace, forcing patience and ingenuity, and reinforcing the ancient Spartan principle that victory depended as much on cunning and perception as on strength and courage. Isolation intensified the psychological pressure. Even the most disciplined soldiers began to feel the subtle erosion of certainty. Nights were long and frigid, with little sleep possible as men took alternating watches to protect the unit. Hunger gnawed at resolve and the cold tested endurance. The men were trained to suppress fear, yet here fear was not only natural, it was necessary. Awareness of danger sharpened instincts, heightened attention, and reinforced discipline. The scroll's cryptic language seemed designed to maintain a balance between fear and purpose, urging the men to act decisively while remaining attuned to subtle signs in the environment. The commander faced not only environmental and psychological challenges but also a growing ethical dilemma. The instructions within the Black Scroll suggested objectives that may have conflicted with Spartan law, personal conscience, or the welfare of those they encountered. Lines such as, "Let conscience guide what law cannot dictate," and "Sometimes survival requires silence where action is demanded," hint at the moral complexity that weighed on him. The mountains were more than a physical challenge. They were a moral crucible, testing loyalty, courage, and ethical judgment simultaneously. Evidence suggests that during this phase of the mission, the unit may have encountered resistance. Scouts reported tracks that did not match any known helot, foreign, or Spartan footprint. Fires had been hastily extinguished, and other signs suggested the presence of unseen observers. Whether these were insurgents, rival Spartan factions, or forces unknown is still debated. Regardless, the commander adjusted movements with precision, demonstrating an understanding of strategic concealment that mirrored the lessons of the Cryptia. Every decision became a test of anticipation, observation, and adaptability, blending traditional Spartan military training with a heightened awareness of psychological warfare. The mountains themselves played a deceptive role. Narrow paths that appeared safe could conceal sudden drops. Seemingly solid rocks sometimes crumbled underfoot. Natural sounds carried unpredictably, creating illusions of movement or proximity. The commander taught his men to interpret the land as an extension of strategy. Shadows could indicate cover or threat, wind could reveal enemy movement, and the rhythm of the environment could guide or mislead. The scroll's guidance was instrumental, offering coded wisdom that transformed ordinary observations into actionable intelligence, merging the physical and cognitive aspects of survival. Morale was an ongoing concern. The soldiers were accustomed to obeying orders without question. Yet here, ambiguity tested even their discipline. Rumors circulated of figures glimpsed at a distance, strange fires, or sounds that could not be explained. Each sighting, each unexplained phenomenon, became an exercise in judgment, to act or not to act, to risk exposure or maintain concealment. The commander's role evolved from tactical leadership to psychological stewardship, maintaining unity and resolve while navigating uncertainties that defied conventional military logic. Despite these challenges, the unit displayed remarkable adaptation. Men moved fluidly across ridges, using natural features as cover and creating patterns of movement that made tracking nearly impossible. Observational skills sharpened. Soldiers began noticing subtle shifts in foliage, the faintest impressions in soil, and the minute differences in animal sounds, all interpreted as signals of danger or pathways of safety. The Black Scroll's phrasing, metaphorical yet precise, served as both instruction and mental framework, reinforcing vigilance, patience, and discernment. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the mission had entered a stage where traditional military measures alone could not ensure survival. Physical strength, discipline, and Spartan courage were necessary but insufficient. Success required insight, ethical judgment, and psychological acuity, a combination that the commander and his men were only beginning to master. The ridges had become both adversary and tutor, pushing them to their limits while preparing them for challenges that would ultimately test the boundaries of human endurance, loyalty, and morality. Section 13 concludes with the sense that the mission has evolved from a tactical operation into a multidimensional test of body, mind, and conscience. The mountains are no longer passive terrain. They are an active participant, shaping events, revealing vulnerabilities, and amplifying both fear and insight. The Black Scroll continues to guide, warn, and inspire, yet its cryptic instructions demand interpretation and judgment. As the unit progresses deeper into this shadowed landscape, the stakes rise, foreshadowing the extraordinary challenges and mysteries that will define the vanished commander's legacy for centuries to come. The higher the unit ascended into the mountains, the more the landscape seemed to transform into something otherworldly. Jagged peaks rose like the spines of a sleeping giant, the wind carrying sounds that bent perception and played tricks on even the most disciplined soldiers. Sunlight filtered through dense pine canopies in fractured beams, casting elongated shadows that shifted with every gust. Each step became a negotiation with the terrain itself, a balance of caution and necessity, where one misstep could result in injury or death. The commander's men were trained for endurance and adaptability, yet the Teejido's range introduced a complexity that no Spartan drill could fully prepare them for. The mountains were no longer just a setting. They were an active agent shaping every choice, every movement, every heartbeat. The Black Scroll's cryptic instructions began to resonate with renewed urgency in this environment. Lines such as "move as if the earth conceals you, yet trusts you not," or "the stones remember those who pass but judge none," became practical as well as philosophical. Every gesture, every footfall, every placement of equipment had to account for concealment, stability, and the unseen. The soldiers learned to interpret environmental cues, the direction of wind for scent detection, the subtle changes in leaf patterns to anticipate unseen movement, and the rhythm of distant streams as a natural clock for coordination. Here, the scroll functioned not only as a tactical guide but as a cognitive framework, a lens through which perception and action were intertwined. Isolation intensified the psychological pressures on the men. Nights were bitterly cold, and fires were kept minimal to avoid detection. Food rations were scarce, forcing soldiers to rely on natural foraging under conditions that were simultaneously hazardous and unfamiliar. The mountains exacted a mental toll equal to their physical challenge. Even the most steadfast soldiers began to experience moments of doubt, whispers of fear, and fleeting hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and sensory deprivation. The commander, aware of these dangers, implemented rotations, exercises in focus, and meditative practices derived from the scroll's guidance, emphasizing the integration of mental discipline with physical endurance. The presence of potential external threats added another layer of tension. Scouts occasionally reported signs of other movement. Broken branches, footprints of uncertain origin, and the faint smell of smoke. These could have been local insurgents, helot agitators, or rival Spartan factions monitoring the operation. The uncertainty amplified anxiety within the unit. The commander responded with a combination of strategic patience and psychological reinforcement, guiding men to interpret threats without succumbing to panic, blending instinct with reason and obedience with judgment. One of the most striking aspects of this phase was the commander's attention to moral and ethical guidance, embedded in the scroll's phrasing. Phrases like "the law sees but does not weigh conscience" suggest a mission that required decisions beyond standard Spartan doctrine. Obedience alone was insufficient. Judgment, moral courage, and the understanding of consequences were essential. The mountains, in their imposing, inscrutable presence, mirrored this challenge, forcing the men to confront choices where loyalty, survival, and morality could conflict. The terrain itself provided both protection and hazard. Narrow ledges offered concealment but risked fatal falls. Hidden crevices could shelter the unit, yet they might also harbor unknown dangers. Water sources were vital but vulnerable points, requiring careful selection and constant vigilance. The commander's use of the scroll was instrumental here. Every passage seemed to encode lessons in observation, adaptation, and risk management, guiding decisions that balanced safety with strategic necessity. Fatigue compounded every difficulty. Continuous marches over uneven, slippery terrain, combined with limited rest and meager rations, taxed even the hardiest soldiers. Yet these physical hardships reinforced cohesion. The unit depended entirely on each individual's discipline, judgment, and cooperation. Missteps could compromise the entire operation. The scroll emphasized subtlety, patience, and interdependence, reinforcing a philosophy where survival required harmony with both the environment and one's comrades. The commander's leadership became increasingly pivotal. Beyond issuing orders, he functioned as a moral and psychological anchor, interpreting the scroll's guidance, managing fear, and fostering resilience. His decisions balanced tactical necessity with ethical considerations, reflecting the scroll's implicit insistence that survival and conscience must coexist. Each choice, from route selection to camp placement, exemplified a nuanced understanding of human behavior under extreme stress. By the middle of this stage, the mountains had transformed the mission into a multidimensional challenge. Success demanded the integration of physical skill, psychological acuity, and moral judgment. The scroll served as both guide and mirror, reflecting the demands of the environment and the human condition alike. The unit's adaptation to these pressures demonstrates the extraordinary discipline and intellect required to navigate a mission that defied conventional military understanding. Section 14 closes with a heightened sense of suspense and anticipation. The unit has moved beyond the familiar and entered a zone where every action carries amplified consequence. The mountains are no longer merely obstacles. They are active participants, shaping decisions, perception, and morale. The Black Scroll remains the linchpin, offering guidance, moral reflection, and tactical insight. Yet it is clear that the challenges ahead will test the commander and his men in ways that transcend traditional warfare, setting the stage for decisions, revelations, and disappearances that will echo through history. The unit's progress into the more treacherous sections of the Teejido's range marked a turning point in both the physical and psychological dimensions of the mission. These mountains, once a backdrop to disciplined marches and strategic maneuvers, had become a living labyrinth that seemed to anticipate the soldiers' movements, testing their endurance, adaptability, and perception. Narrow ridges dropped sharply into hidden ravines, each step demanding precision and unwavering focus. The wind, howling through rock formations, carried sounds that deceived the ears, while shifting light fractured shadows into shapes that were both threatening and elusive. Every element of the landscape demanded attention, and the men quickly learned that survival depended on more than strength or skill. It demanded intuition, vigilance, and a profound understanding of the terrain as a strategic partner rather than a mere obstacle. The commander relied heavily on the Black Scroll to navigate these perilous heights. Its cryptic phrases, "Move where the stone trusts no one, yet shelters all, let shadow guide your eyes, and silence your tongue," served as both practical instruction and philosophical meditation. Each passage required interpretation, and the soldiers had to internalize the guidance in order to act with confidence and subtlety. The scroll had become more than a manual. It was a cognitive tool, a lens through which the mountain's nuances could be understood and anticipated. In many ways, the scroll was a teacher, instilling lessons that combined tactical skill with psychological resilience and ethical reflection. The strain on the men was mounting. Physical exhaustion was compounded by limited rations and harsh environmental conditions. Cold rain, biting winds, and uneven terrain made every movement an ordeal, and even the most hardened Spartans began to feel the creeping effects of fatigue. But it was the psychological burden that proved most challenging. Isolation, constant vigilance, and the uncertainty of the mission eroded confidence and magnified fear. Strange noises, animal calls, rock slides, and the occasional indistinct echo were interpreted as potential threats, creating tension that had to be carefully managed to maintain cohesion. The commander's leadership was critical. He emphasized calm observation, steady routines, and the disciplined interpretation of the scroll's instructions to mitigate the men's growing anxiety. Encounters with the environment took on a more unpredictable quality. The unit discovered natural hazards that could not have been anticipated: hidden crevices, unstable rock ledges, and sudden torrents that transformed familiar paths into deadly obstacles. Scouts reported subtle signs of other presence: footprints not matching Spartan patterns, ashes from fires extinguished too quickly to provide warmth, and traces of movement suggesting surveillance. These discoveries reinforced the importance of discretion and the application of the scroll's lessons, requiring constant adaptation to both natural and human threats. The moral complexity of the mission became increasingly evident. The scroll's guidance implied that strict obedience to Spartan law was insufficient. Judgment, conscience, and strategic ethics were all necessary for survival. Phrases such as "law binds the body," "conscience binds the soul," suggest that the commander faced decisions that challenged traditional notions of duty. Orders were no longer purely tactical. They carried implications for human life, loyalty, and honor. The men were not only surviving the terrain but navigating a landscape of moral ambiguity, where right and wrong were often indistinguishable and where the consequences of action or inaction were profound. Tactics evolved in response to these pressures. Movement was deliberate and coordinated, using natural features for concealment while anticipating both environmental hazards and potential observation. The men refined their senses, detecting subtle shifts in foliage, listening for minute variations in wind, and interpreting shadows and light as indicators of movement. Each decision became a test of judgment, requiring the integration of observation, strategy, and ethical reasoning. The mountains, in this sense, were instructors as much as obstacles, teaching lessons in patience, adaptability, and foresight that could not be replicated in Spartan training grounds. Camaraderie and trust became central to survival. The men relied on one another for guidance, support, and verification of observations. Mutual vigilance was essential, as a single lapse could expose the unit to danger or compromise the mission. The commander cultivated an environment in which trust and interdependence were as vital as individual skill, emphasizing that the strength of the unit was inseparable from the cohesion and judgment of its members. By the 8th day, the unit had entered a zone where terrain, weather, and psychological stress converged to create near-constant pressure. Every decision, whether to move forward, rest, forage, or adjust formation, required careful evaluation. Mistakes were costly, and yet hesitation could be equally dangerous. The Black Scroll's cryptic advice guided these decisions, blending strategy, ethical reflection, and psychological conditioning into a cohesive framework. Section 15 closes with the sense that the mission has transcended conventional warfare, entering a multidimensional trial of endurance, perception, and morality. The mountains are no longer passive. They are active participants shaping every action and reaction. The commander and his men navigate not only terrain but the human condition itself, relying on discipline, insight, and the enduring wisdom encoded in the Black Scroll. Each step deeper into the mountains brings new challenges, foreshadowing revelations, choices, and the eventual disappearance that will haunt the memory of Sparta for generations. The mountains had now become more than a physical obstacle. They had assumed the role of a relentless adversary, testing the Spartan soldiers on levels that transcended strength and discipline. The paths narrowed into perilous ledges where a single misstep could result in a fatal fall, while hidden crevices and sudden drop-offs demanded constant attention and careful planning. Wind gusts roared through the ridges, carrying ambiguous sounds that could be either natural or the signals of an unseen observer. Every movement required precision, deliberation, and a constant negotiation between caution and necessity. For the soldiers, the Teijito's range had become a living entity, an omnipresent force that demanded respect, vigilance, and insight. The Black Scroll guided the commander through these extreme conditions, its language both cryptic and precise. Passages like "Move where the mountain trusts no one, yet shelters all," and "The shadow is your companion, but silence your greatest weapon," were not merely tactical suggestions. They were principles for navigating an environment that defied conventional understanding. The soldiers were forced to internalize these instructions, transforming abstract guidance into instinctual knowledge. Every movement, every pause, and every glance was informed by the scroll's teachings, reinforcing a fusion of physical skill, mental acuity, and moral awareness that Spartan training alone could not provide. Isolation intensified the psychological strain. Nights were bitterly cold, and limited shelter made sleep fleeting and fitful. The men's senses were heightened to the point of exhaustion. Every crack of a branch, rustle of foliage, or distant howl became a potential warning of threat. Sleep deprivation, hunger, and constant vigilance began to erode confidence, amplifying the tension and leaving the soldiers vulnerable to fear and doubt. The commander, recognizing these dangers, relied on structured routines, observation exercises, and meditative practices drawn from the scroll to stabilize morale. He emphasized the necessity of discipline, yet acknowledged the importance of human judgment, fostering an environment where fear was acknowledged, managed, and transformed into heightened awareness. Physical challenges were equally formidable. The terrain required endless climbing, descending, and lateral movement over unstable rock, slippery moss, and loose scree. Water sources were scarce and required careful planning to access safely without leaving traces that might betray their presence. Rations were minimal, forcing soldiers to forage under hazardous conditions, further blending the line between survival and exposure. The mountains dictated the pace, the path, and the strategy, demanding constant adaptation. Success depended not only on strength and endurance but on perception, intuition, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. External threats added another layer of complexity. Scouts occasionally discovered footprints, discarded materials, or faint signs of fires that could not be attributed to natural causes. The source of these intrusions remained uncertain. Local insurgents, rival Spartan factions, or perhaps enemies yet unidentified. The commander interpreted these signs with caution, balancing the need for action against the potential for traps or deception. The scroll's guidance became indispensable, framing observation and decision-making in a manner that allowed the men to navigate ambiguity while maintaining cohesion and purpose. Ethical challenges became increasingly intertwined with tactical ones. The Black Scroll suggested that not all decisions could be made according to Spartan law or standard military doctrine. Phrases like, "conscience weighs heavier than command," and "sometimes silence preserves what action would destroy," imply that the commander faced choices in which morality, loyalty, and survival were in constant tension. The mountains, by creating isolation and forcing independence of judgment, amplified this moral crucible. Obedience alone was insufficient. Judgment and ethical discernment were essential for maintaining both survival and honor. The unit refined its operational skills in response to these pressures. Movement became deliberate, silent, and coordinated. Soldiers learned to detect subtle environmental changes, the orientation of leaves signaling wind direction, the faint impression of footprints in soil, and the irregular patterns of wildlife. Every observation was assessed for potential threat or opportunity. The commander's instructions, encoded in the scroll, were designed to transform ordinary awareness into actionable intelligence, blending instinct, analysis, and moral reflection into a unified approach to survival and mission execution. Camaraderie and trust remained critical. The unit relied on mutual vigilance and verification of observations, knowing that one misstep or misjudgment could compromise the entire mission. The commander fostered cohesion through example, modeling judgment under pressure, ethical consideration, and discipline. Soldiers were trained to interpret the scroll, act decisively, and rely on one another, reinforcing the principle that the strength of the unit was inseparable from the reliability, perception, and courage of its individual members. By the 12th day, the unit had reached a point where the mountains had shaped them as much as they shaped their progress. Physical skill, psychological resilience, and moral judgment had become inseparable, each reinforcing the other. The Black Scroll remained the linchpin, guiding not only tactical decisions but also ethical and perceptual frameworks. The mission had transformed into a multidimensional test of human capability, where survival depended as much on discernment and conscience as on discipline and force. Section 16 concludes with a deep sense of foreboding and anticipation. The unit's immersion in the mountains has created a scenario where every step, observation, and decision carries amplified consequence. The mountains act as both tutor and adversary, shaping perception, judgment, and cohesion. The Black Scroll continues to serve as guide and moral compass, but the challenges ahead, both seen and unseen, threaten to exceed even the extraordinary capabilities of the Spartan commander and his men, setting the stage for decisions and events whose consequences will echo through history. The unit's journey into the upper reaches of the Teajitos Range had now reached a critical juncture. The terrain transformed into a forbidding labyrinth of sheer cliffs, jagged ridges, and hidden ravines that challenged even the most experienced soldiers. Every step required precision, every movement was a negotiation with gravity and perception, and every pause was filled with the constant hum of danger. From shifting rocks, sudden gusts of wind, or the faintest, unidentifiable sounds echoing through the mountains. The soldiers, though hardened by Spartan training, were now confronting a reality where conventional discipline and courage were insufficient. The mountains demanded adaptation, intuition, and an intimate understanding of both the physical and psychological dimensions of survival. The Black Scroll had evolved into an indispensable companion. Its cryptic lines, Walk where shadow and stone converge, yet trust neither fully, and the unseen weighs as heavily as the visible. Guided movements, dictated routines, and instructed caution at a level beyond ordinary military strategy. Soldiers internalized these principles, translating metaphor into action, and allowing the scroll to inform decisions on positioning, observation, and ethical conduct. It was a fusion of tactical, philosophical, and moral guidance, demanding constant engagement of mind and body. In effect, the scroll had become a cognitive framework for interpreting an environment that was both hostile and instructive. Isolation intensified the psychological strain. The upper ridges were exposed to bitter winds, sudden storms, and nights so cold that sleep was brief and fitful. Fires could not be maintained for warmth without risking exposure, and food supplies were limited, forcing soldiers to forage in hazardous terrain. Under these conditions, even the most disciplined men felt the creeping erosion of confidence and clarity. Every sound, a rock sliding, a distant animal call, or a shadow flickering at the edge of vision, was amplified in significance, demanding interpretation. The commander, keenly aware of these stresses, instituted rotations, observation drills, and meditative practices inspired by the scroll, emphasizing the integration of psychological endurance with tactical skill. Physical hazards continued to shape daily life. Narrow ledges, unstable scree, and hidden crevices required constant attention. Water sources were rare, often in exposed locations, necessitating careful planning and stealth. The mountains dictated the rhythm of movement, forcing the unit to develop an acute sense of timing, balance, and environmental awareness. Survival depended not merely on physical prowess, but on the ability to perceive patterns, anticipate danger, and act decisively under pressure. External threats became increasingly ambiguous and unsettling. Scouts occasionally discovered footprints, traces of fires hastily extinguished, or other subtle evidence of presence that could not be immediately identified. Were these insurgents, rival Spartans, or unknown adversaries? The commander relied on careful interpretation, applying both observation and intuition in accordance with the scroll's guidance. Decisions were never simple. The margin for error was minimal, and the consequences of misjudgment could be fatal. The mission's ethical dimension grew more pronounced with every day in isolation. The Black Scroll's guidance suggested that obedience alone was insufficient. Moral discernment was required alongside strategy. Passages like conscience measures beyond law, and sometimes inaction safeguards what action would destroy, reveal the weight of decision-making faced by the commander. The terrain, by imposing isolation and demanding independent judgment, magnified this moral crucible. Soldiers were forced to navigate choices where loyalty, survival, and morality intersected in complex, often ambiguous ways. Operational tactics adapted to these pressures. Movements became coordinated, silent, and deliberate. Soldiers observed subtle environmental cues, leaf orientation to interpret wind direction, faint impressions in soil indicating recent passage, and animal behavior that could suggest risk or opportunity. Each observation was processed, weighed, and acted upon, integrating instinct, ethical reflection, and tactical acumen. The mountains themselves had become instructors, teaching lessons in patience, foresight, and resilience that could not be replicated in traditional Spartan training. Cohesion and trust were essential to survival. Soldiers depended on mutual vigilance, verification of observations, and support in both physical and psychological challenges. The commander's leadership emphasized not only tactical execution but also the reinforcement of trust, discipline, and moral judgment. Survival required a delicate balance of individual initiative and collective responsibility, with the unit functioning as a single organism in constant dialogue with the mountains. By the 18th day, the unit's adaptation had reached a level where physical skill, psychological resilience, and moral judgment were deeply intertwined. The Black Scroll remained central, guiding action and thought alike, providing structure in a terrain that demanded continuous attention, reflection, and ethical discernment. The mission had become a multidimensional trial in which survival depended as much on judgment, intuition, and conscience as on strength, training, and discipline. Section 18 closes with a mounting sense of suspense and inevitability. The mountains are no longer passive terrain. They are dynamic participants shaping perception, action, and moral reflection. The unit moves deeper into a landscape where every decision carries amplified consequence, where every observation could be critical, and where the black scroll continues to illuminate yet challenge. Ahead lies the convergence of extreme physical endurance, moral ambiguity, and psychological strain that will define the fate of the commander and his men, establishing a mystery whose echoes will endure far beyond their disappearance. The unit had now penetrated the heart of the Teojido's range, where the mountains rose like jagged sentinels, imposing both awe and terror on those who traversed their heights. The paths became narrower, treacherous, and almost impossibly steep, while the landscape itself seemed to challenge every step. Cliffs fell away into unseen ravines, and boulders loomed unpredictably, threatening to shift underfoot. The wind screamed through rocky corridors, carrying sounds that blurred the line between natural and unnatural. Every snap of a twig, every distant echo, every fleeting shadow demanded instant interpretation. For these Spartan soldiers, trained to endure fear and pain, the mountains had become an almost sentient adversary, a force that tested perception, patience, and resolve to their utmost limits. The Black Scroll, once a tactical manual, had become an essential lifeline, offering cryptic guidance that required both interpretation and intuition. Phrases like, "The stone sees all, yet speaks nothing, and trust not what is seen. Let the unseen be your counsel," forced the soldiers to engage their minds as rigorously as their bodies. Movement was not simply forward, it was deliberate, calculated, and synchronized, with every footfall informed by environmental observation, the behavior of companions, and an ethical consideration of the consequences of their actions. The scroll's wisdom blurred the line between survival and philosophy, teaching lessons in patience, foresight, and moral awareness that were as critical as any tactical maneuver. Isolation weighed heavily on the men. Nights were long, cold, and pierced by the whistling wind, while fires could be kept only at minimal levels to avoid detection. Sleep was fragmented, and even brief rests carried the constant awareness of potential threats, both environmental and human. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, sapping both energy and morale. Sensory fatigue amplified the smallest stimuli. A distant rockfall might suggest pursuit. A rustling of leaves could signal unseen observers, and shadows at the periphery of vision were often misinterpreted as danger. The commander, attuned to these pressures, instituted strict routines, observation exercises, and mental disciplines derived from the scroll to maintain focus, cohesion, and calm. Physical hazards grew increasingly unforgiving. The terrain demanded climbing, balancing, and maneuvering over slick moss, loose scree, and jagged rock faces. Water sources were scarce and exposed, requiring careful access under the constant threat of observation or ambush. Rations were limited, forcing reliance on foraging that carried additional risk. Every step, every pause, and every decision required precise judgment and absolute awareness. The mountains dictated both pace and priority, enforcing lessons in adaptability, observation, and resourcefulness that far exceeded conventional Spartan training. Evidence of external threats became more frequent and unsettling. Scouts reported footprints that could not be readily identified, traces of fires hastily extinguished, and other subtle signs of possible surveillance. The source remained ambiguous. Local insurgents, rival Spartan factions, or perhaps unknown adversaries. The commander's decisions relied heavily on careful interpretation, balancing the risk of engagement against the necessity of maintaining stealth. The Black Scroll's guidance was indispensable here, transforming observation into informed action and allowing the men to navigate ambiguity with discipline and strategic caution. The ethical dimension of the mission was amplified by isolation and complexity. The scroll suggested that obedience alone was insufficient. Moral discernment and ethical judgment were required alongside strategy. Phrases such as "conscience measures beyond law" and "sometimes the silence of an action preserves what action would destroy" highlight the weight of decision-making imposed on the commander. Each choice carried consequences that could affect survival, loyalty, and honor, forcing the soldiers to engage with the mission on levels far beyond physical endurance. Operational tactics had become highly refined. Movement was silent, coordinated, and fluid, guided by both environmental cues and the lessons of the scroll. Soldiers observed minute shifts in foliage, the behavior of wildlife, and subtle patterns in terrain, translating these signs into tactical decisions. Instinct, ethical reasoning, and strategic observation became inseparable. The mountains were no longer merely a backdrop. They were a teacher and a test, imparting lessons in vigilance, foresight, and psychological resilience that could not be learned elsewhere. Camaraderie and trust were indispensable. The unit functioned as a single organism, each soldier's vigilance protecting the whole. The commander's leadership extended beyond issuing orders. He was a stabilizing presence, modeling judgment under extreme stress, reinforcing ethical decision-making, and fostering mutual reliance. Cohesion, perception, and discipline were intertwined, forming a collective intelligence that allowed the unit to navigate the mountain's constant threats. By the 19th day, the unit's adaptation had reached a profound level. Physical skill, psychological resilience, and ethical discernment had merged into a unified capability. The Black Scroll remained central, guiding both tactical and moral judgment, offering a lens through which the complex environment could be understood and navigated. The mission had evolved into a multidimensional challenge where perception, intuition, and conscience were as vital to survival as strength, skill, and discipline. Section 19 closes with a heightened sense of suspense and anticipation. The mountains are fully realized participants, shaping decisions, perception, and ethical responsibility. The unit moves deeper into the terrain, where each observation and action carries amplified consequence. The Black Scroll continues to illuminate, challenge, and guide, yet the complexity of what lies ahead, combining physical peril, moral uncertainty, and psychological strain, foreshadows a series of revelations and choices that will define the commander's legacy and the enduring mystery of his disappearance. The unit had now entered the most forbidding stretches of the Teijito's range, a place where the mountains seemed to rise impossibly high, casting long shadows that distorted perception and swallowed sound. Paths narrowed into razor-like ridges, cliffs dropped into fathomless voids, and jagged outcrops threatened to shift or collapse underfoot. The wind roared through the mountains with a voice that was both menacing and hypnotic, carrying echoes that blurred the line between reality and imagination. Each step was a negotiation between instinct and calculation, every decision a test of judgment under conditions that challenged the limits of human endurance. For these Spartans, trained for battle and hardship, the mountains had become an omnipresent adversary, demanding vigilance, adaptability, and insight at every moment. The Black Scroll remained their indispensable guide, offering cryptic directives that were as much philosophical as they were tactical. Lines such as, "Let stone conceal, but never trust," and "The shadow is a companion," yet it whispers secrets of danger, demanded interpretation and application. The soldiers learned to translate metaphor into practical strategy, choosing paths that offered cover, interpreting environmental cues for threats, and synchronizing movements with precision. The scroll had evolved into a cognitive tool that integrated physical skill, psychological awareness, and ethical judgment, transforming abstract wisdom into actionable insight. Isolation exerted an unrelenting psychological pressure. Nights were bitterly cold, and the unit could not maintain fires for warmth without risking detection. Sleep was fitful, punctuated by the sounds of wind, falling rocks, and distant, unidentifiable noises. Hunger gnawed at morale, while continuous vigilance strained attention and judgment. The commander recognized the importance of mental endurance and implemented structured routines, observational exercises, and meditation-inspired practices drawn from the scroll, blending Spartan discipline with heightened psychological awareness. Physical hazards intensified with every step. Narrow ledges required careful balance. Loose scree and moss-covered rocks threatened sudden falls. Hidden crevices demanded constant scrutiny. Water sources were rare and exposed, necessitating stealth and careful planning. Rations were minimal, forcing foraging under dangerous conditions. The mountains dictated the pace, the path, and even the timing of rest. Success depended on the seamless integration of endurance, observation, and decision-making, with consequences for every error magnified by the extreme environment. Evidence of other presences became increasingly frequent, heightening tension. Scouts reported footprints inconsistent with Spartan patterns, traces of fires quickly extinguished, and subtle disturbances in terrain suggesting unseen observers. The source remained ambiguous. Could they be insurgents, rival factions, or unknown forces? The commander's interpretation required caution and discretion. The Black Scroll provided a framework to navigate these uncertainties, turning ambiguous signs into actionable intelligence while maintaining stealth and cohesion. Ethical challenges were inseparable from tactical decisions. The scroll suggested that strict obedience was insufficient. Moral discernment was necessary alongside strategy. Phrases such as "conscience weighs heavier than command" and "silence may safeguard what action would destroy" illustrated the complexity of decision-making in isolation. Each choice carried the potential for consequences that extended beyond survival to issues of loyalty, honor, and moral integrity. The mountains, by imposing isolation and demanding independent judgment, intensified this moral crucible. Operational tactics were refined to near perfection. Movement was silent, coordinated, and deliberate, guided by environmental observation, instinct, and the scroll's lessons. Soldiers detected subtle changes in foliage, animal behavior, and soil, translating them into tactical advantage. The mountains became both teacher and adversary, instructing lessons in patience, foresight, and vigilance that could not be replicated elsewhere. Instinct, strategy, and ethical reflection merged into a seamless approach to survival. Trust and cohesion were indispensable. Each soldier's vigilance protected the entire unit. The commander's leadership extended beyond tactical instruction, reinforcing discipline, trust, and moral awareness. Cohesion, observation, and judgment were intertwined. Survival depended on each member's capacity to act decisively while supporting the group. The Black Scroll reinforced this collective intelligence, ensuring that the unit operated as a single organism in harmony with the environment and each other. By the 20th day, the soldiers had reached a level of adaptation that blurred the line between human capability and environmental attunement. Physical skill, psychological resilience, and moral discernment had fused into a unified operational capacity. The Black Scroll remained central, guiding every decision, offering insight, and framing perception. The mission had evolved into a multidimensional trial, where survival relied on observation, judgment, and ethical understanding as much as endurance, strength, and discipline. Section 20 closes with a heightened sense of tension and inevitable consequence. The mountains now function as active participants, shaping every action, perception, and decision. The Black Scroll continues to illuminate, guide, and challenge, yet the mysteries ahead, combining extreme physical danger, psychological strain, and ethical complexity, foreshadow events that will test the commander and his men beyond anything they have yet faced, leading to decisions and revelations whose echoes will endure through history. The unit had now reached a stage of their journey where the mountains no longer felt like mere obstacles. They were sentient forces, shaping not only the soldiers' movements but their very thoughts. Narrow ridges twisted into labyrinthine passages, cliffs fell away into shadowed chasms, and every step demanded precision and forethought. The wind, a constant presence, carried ambiguous sounds that teased perception, from the whisper of loose stones to the distant cry of birds. Even the most disciplined Spartans, hardened through years of training and battle, found themselves questioning the reliability of their senses. In this environment, perception became as vital as strength. Every decision, however small, could carry consequences of life or death. The mountains were no longer passive. They were instructors, adversaries, and a mirror reflecting the limits of human endurance. The Black Scroll remained the keystone of the mission. Its cryptic instructions, lines such as "trust in the unseen," for it guides where sight cannot, and "the stone judges all who pass, yet it reveals to none," were interpreted in both literal and philosophical terms. Soldiers moved with deliberate care, using shadows, natural cover, and the subtle contours of the land to guide each step. Every gesture, glance, and footfall was informed by the scroll's lessons, which merged tactical acumen with ethical and psychological insight. The guidance was not prescriptive but interpretive, demanding judgment, patience, and an intimate understanding of the environment. Isolation imposed a relentless psychological strain. Nights were bitterly cold, with minimal shelter and scant opportunities for rest. Fires could not be maintained without compromising stealth, forcing soldiers to endure extreme discomfort. Hunger gnawed at morale, while the constant need for vigilance frayed mental endurance. Every sound, a falling rock, a rustling bush, or the echo of distant movement, was magnified, creating an ever-present tension. The commander responded with structured routines, observational exercises, and mental disciplines inspired by the scroll, blending Spartan rigor with heightened psychological awareness. These measures helped maintain focus, cohesion, and the fragile stability of morale under extreme conditions. Physical hazards remained relentless. Paths were narrow and precarious, rocks unstable and slick with moss or rain. Hidden crevices demanded careful scrutiny, and water sources were both scarce and exposed. Rations were minimal, requiring foraging that increased exposure to danger. The mountains dictated rhythm, pace, and strategy, ensuring that survival depended not only on physical skill but on heightened awareness, foresight, and rapid decision-making. Mistakes were magnified, and every action had the potential to cascade into life-threatening consequences. Encounters with other presences became more frequent and unsettling. Scouts reported footprints that defied recognition, traces of hastily extinguished fires, and subtle environmental disturbances suggesting observation by unseen eyes. The source of these signs was uncertain: local insurgents, rival Spartan factions, or unknown entities. The commander relied on careful interpretation and the scroll's guidance to transform ambiguity into informed strategy. Maintaining stealth, cohesion, and preparedness under such uncertainty became paramount. The ethical dimension of the mission intensified. The scroll implied that strict obedience to orders or law alone was insufficient. Moral discernment was required alongside tactical judgment. Lines such as "conscience weighs more than command" and "sometimes silence protects what action would destroy" illuminated the weight of responsibility on the commander's shoulders. Isolation amplified this moral crucible, forcing choices where survival, loyalty, and honor intersected in complex and often ambiguous ways. Every decision carried ethical, strategic, and psychological implications, entwining the soldiers' fates with the hidden logic of the mountains. Operational tactics had become a refined art. Movements were silent, coordinated, and responsive to subtle environmental cues. Soldiers interpreted changes in leaf orientation, animal behavior, and soil impressions to anticipate risk or opportunity. Every action demanded integration of instinct, ethical reasoning, and strategic awareness. The mountains had become both teacher and adversary, instructing lessons in patience, foresight, and psychological resilience that could not be replicated in Spartan training grounds. Camaraderie and trust were essential. Each soldier's vigilance protected the whole unit. The commander's leadership extended beyond issuing orders. It reinforced discipline, trust, and moral judgment, ensuring cohesion under extreme stress. Survival relied on collective intelligence, with individual skill, observation, and judgment functioning as integral parts of the unit's overall capability. By the 21st day, the unit had achieved a state where physical endurance, psychological resilience, and moral discernment were deeply intertwined. The Black Scroll remained the central guide, informing tactical and ethical decisions, framing perception, and offering insight into both natural and human threats. The mission had evolved into a complex interplay of survival, morality, and perception, where every action carried amplified consequence. Section 21 closes with a sense of imminent transformation. The mountains, now fully realized as active participants, shape perception, decision-making, and ethical responsibility. The unit moves deeper into terrain that demands complete integration of skill, judgment, and conscience. The Black Scroll continues to illuminate and challenge, but ahead lie dangers, revelations, and moral tests that will define the ultimate fate of the commander and his men, deepening the mystery that has already begun to echo through Spartan history. The unit had entered a domain of the Taygetos Mountains that seemed almost removed from the natural world. Jagged peaks rose sharply into a sky perpetually cloaked in mist, while shadowed valleys yawned like the mouths of ancient beasts. Paths became treacherous, fractured by unseen fissures, and every ridge presented a deadly challenge to balance and perception. The wind carried a chorus of ambiguous sounds, rocks shifting, distant waterfalls, and the haunting whistle of air through narrow passes that blurred the line between danger and illusion. Even the most seasoned Spartan soldiers, trained to endure fear and hardship, felt their senses betray them. Here, perception was as vital as skill. Instinct and observation dictated life or death. The mountains were no longer merely obstacles. They had become sentient forces, testing the men's endurance, judgment, and cohesion at every step. The Black Scroll guided every action with its cryptic, layered instructions. Phrases such as "trust the unseen as you would a shield," "yet doubt all that moves," and "silence and shadow hold more wisdom than the spoken word," demanded constant interpretation. Soldiers translated metaphor into practical strategy, using natural cover, environmental cues, and synchronized movements to navigate the deadly terrain. The scroll had evolved from a manual into a cognitive framework, integrating physical skill, psychological acuity, and ethical discernment. Every movement was a negotiation with the mountains, informed by the lessons of the scroll and the collective intuition of the unit. Isolation imposed relentless psychological strain. Nights were bitterly cold, with minimal shelter and little respite from fatigue. Fires, kept small to avoid detection, offered scant warmth, and sleep was interrupted by the constant need for vigilance. Hunger gnawed at morale, while sensory overload magnified every sound and shadow. The commander, attuned to these pressures, implemented routines, meditative exercises, and observation drills drawn from the scroll, blending Spartan discipline with heightened psychological resilience. Soldiers were trained to recognize fear, control anxiety, and transform heightened awareness into tactical advantage, making psychological endurance as vital as physical survival. Physical hazards intensified in scope and consequence. Steep cliffs, unstable scree, hidden fissures, and narrow ledges required unbroken concentration. Water sources were scarce and exposed, necessitating stealth and precise coordination. Rations were minimal, compelling soldiers to forage under hazardous conditions, further heightening the risk. Every decision, from selecting a path to timing rest, carried immediate and amplified consequences. The mountains dictated rhythm, pace, and strategy, enforcing lessons in vigilance, adaptation, and foresight that surpassed traditional Spartan training. Encounters with external threats increased both in frequency and ambiguity. Scouts discovered footprints inconsistent with Spartan patterns, faint traces of fires, and subtle disturbances suggesting observation. The origin remained uncertain. Local insurgents, rival Spartan factions, or unknown adversaries. The commander relied on careful interpretation, informed by the scroll, to navigate these uncertainties while maintaining stealth, cohesion, and readiness. Ambiguity became a constant companion, heightening both tension and the need for collective intelligence. The ethical dimension of the mission became inescapable. The scroll implied that mere obedience was insufficient. Moral discernment was required alongside tactical judgment. Phrases like, "conscience weighs more than command," and "sometimes inaction preserves what action would destroy," highlighted the complexity of decision-making under isolation and extreme pressure. Soldiers were confronted with choices that intertwined survival, loyalty, and honor, magnifying the moral and psychological stakes of each action. The mountains, in their imposing isolation, amplified this crucible, forcing reflection and deliberate judgment at every step. Operational tactics had reached their most refined form. Movements were silent, fluid, and meticulously coordinated. Soldiers interpreted minute environmental cues, shifts in foliage, animal behavior, soil impressions, to anticipate both natural and human threats. Instinct, strategy, and ethical reflection were inseparable. The mountains functioned as both teacher and adversary, providing lessons in patience, observation, foresight, and resilience that could not be learned in conventional Spartan training. Camaraderie and trust were essential to survival. Each soldier's vigilance ensured the safety of the entire unit. The commander reinforced cohesion, discipline, and ethical judgment, transforming the group into a single organism capable of adapting to the mountain's constant challenges. Survival depended on collective intelligence, with each individual's skill, perception, and judgment functioning as integral components of the unit's overall capability. By the 22nd day, the unit had reached a state where physical skill, psychological resilience, and ethical discernment were fully integrated. The Black Scroll remained central, guiding both action and thought, providing insight into natural and human threats alike. The mission had become a multidimensional trial, where survival relied as much on observation, moral reasoning, and judgment as on strength, endurance, and discipline. Section 22 closes with a profound sense of suspense and foreboding. The mountains, fully realized as active participants, shape perception, decision-making, and ethical responsibility. The unit moves deeper into terrain that demands the integration of skill, intuition, and conscience. The Black Scroll continues to illuminate and challenge, yet what lies ahead, hidden dangers, moral dilemmas, and revelations, will test the commander and his men beyond any measure, setting the stage for the climactic resolution of their extraordinary journey and the enduring mystery of their fate. The unit had now reached the very heart of the Teejitos Range, a region so remote and forbidding that it seemed untouched by time. Jagged peaks pierced the clouds, shadowed valleys yawned like the mouths of ancient beasts, and the paths between ridges became narrower and more perilous with every step. Rocks, slick with rain and moss, threatened to give way beneath their feet, while hidden fissures and sudden drop-offs demanded constant vigilance. The wind carried a chorus of ambiguous sounds, falling stones, distant waterfalls, and the eerie whistle of air through narrow passes, blurring the line between natural phenomena and potential threats. Even the most disciplined Spartan soldiers, trained to endure pain and fear, found their senses pushed to the breaking point. Here, survival depended not only on strength or skill but on perception, instinct, and the ability to interpret the world with both caution and intuition. The mountains were no longer passive terrain. They were living, conscious forces, shaping the men's actions and testing their limits in ways that went far beyond physical endurance. The Black Scroll, now more than ever, guided their every movement. Its cryptic lines, "Trust the unseen as you would a shield, yet doubt all that moves and shadow conceals, yet reveals what is hidden to the eye," were interpreted not only for tactical advantage but as a lens through which the soldiers understood the mountains themselves. Every ridge climbed, every passage navigated, and every moment of pause was informed by the scroll's layered wisdom. Soldiers had learned to internalize its guidance, blending it with observation, instinct, and ethical judgment to make decisions that were simultaneously tactical and philosophical. The scroll had become the axis around which their survival revolved, guiding action while provoking reflection on the human condition and the burdens of command. Isolation weighed heavier than ever. Nights were bitterly cold, sleep came in fragments, and the constant need for vigilance left the men in a near-perpetual state of tension. Fires, kept minimal to avoid detection, offered little comfort, and hunger gnawed relentlessly at both body and mind. The psychological strain amplified every sound and shadow. The crack of a branch might signal pursuit, the flutter of leaves could indicate movement, and distant echoes suggested an unseen presence. The commander, aware of the mental toll, continued to implement structured routines, observation exercises, and meditative practices inspired by the scroll, combining Spartan discipline with heightened psychological endurance. These measures helped maintain focus, cohesion, and the fragile balance of morale under extreme and unrelenting pressure. Physical hazards had escalated to the point where every movement required acute attention. Narrow ledges, jagged rocks, loose scree, and hidden crevices demanded constant vigilance. Water sources were rare and exposed, and foraging for sustenance added another layer of risk. The mountains dictated rhythm, strategy, and pace, enforcing lessons in adaptation, foresight, and perceptual acuity that far exceeded anything experienced in Spartan training grounds. The men had learned to move with deliberate precision, to observe minute environmental changes, and to integrate every piece of information into decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. External threats persisted, ambiguous and unsettling. Scouts reported footprints inconsistent with Spartan patterns, faint remnants of fires, and subtle signs that the unit was being observed. Whether these signs indicated insurgents, rival factions, or an unknown presence, the commander relied on careful interpretation, using the scroll to convert ambiguity into actionable intelligence. Maintaining stealth, cohesion, and readiness in the face of uncertain danger became a defining feature of the unit's operations. The ethical dimension reached its zenith. The scroll's guidance emphasized that obedience alone was insufficient. Moral discernment was essential. Lines such as "conscience weighs heavier than command," and "sometimes silence preserves what action would destroy," underscored the profound weight of responsibility the commander bore. Decisions now involved survival, loyalty, and honor simultaneously, creating a moral crucible intensified by isolation and extreme risk. Each choice carried long-term consequences, shaping the identity of the unit and the legacy of its leader. Operational tactics had become nearly instinctual. Movements were silent, precise, and synchronized, with every soldier reading the environment and each other to anticipate danger. Observations of subtle shifts in foliage, animal behavior, and soil patterns were interpreted with a level of acuity honed over weeks of extreme conditions. The mountains had become instructors, imparting lessons in patience, foresight, and resilience that transcended traditional Spartan education. Instinct, strategy, and ethical reflection had fused into a seamless approach to survival. Camaraderie and trust were now the keystones of endurance. Each soldier's vigilance safeguarded the entire unit, while the commander's leadership reinforced discipline, ethical judgment, and cohesion. The group functioned as a single entity, capable of responding with collective intelligence to the constant and multifaceted threats of the mountains. By the 23rd day, the unit had reached a state of profound integration. Physical endurance, psychological resilience, and ethical discernment had become inseparable. The Black Scroll remained the central guide, framing perception, informing strategy, and offering insight into both natural and human threats. The mission had become a multidimensional trial, in which every action, observation, and decision carried amplified consequence. Section 23 closes with a sense of haunting resolution. The mountains, now fully realized as conscious forces shaping every aspect of the journey, have tested the limits of human capability and moral judgment. The Black Scroll continues to illuminate, challenge, and guide. Yet the ultimate fate of the commander and his men hangs in a tense equilibrium between revelation and disappearance. The story reaches its emotional climax here, leaving an indelible mark on those who imagine it. A tale of endurance, mystery, and the profound intersection of human courage, perception, and conscience, echoing across history and time. The unit had now reached the very heart of the Teejitos Range, a region so remote and forbidding that it seemed untouched by time. Jagged peaks pierced the clouds, shadowed valleys yawned like the mouths of ancient beasts, and the paths between ridges became narrower and more perilous with every step. Rocks, slick with rain and moss, threatened to give way beneath their feet, while hidden fissures and sudden drop-offs demanded constant vigilance. The wind carried a chorus of ambiguous sounds: falling stones, distant waterfalls, and the eerie whistle of air through narrow passes, blurring the line between natural phenomena and potential threats. Even the most disciplined Spartan soldiers, trained to endure pain and fear, found their senses pushed to the breaking point. Here, survival depended not only on strength or skill but on perception, instinct, and the ability to interpret the world with both caution and intuition. The mountains were no longer passive terrain. They were living, conscious forces, shaping the men's actions and testing their limits in ways that went far beyond physical endurance. The Black Scroll, now more than ever, guided their every movement. Its cryptic lines, "Trust the unseen as you would a shield, yet doubt all that moves and shadow conceals, yet reveals what is hidden to the eye," were interpreted not only for tactical advantage but as a lens through which the soldiers understood the mountains themselves. Every ridge climbed, every passage navigated, and every moment of pause was informed by the scroll's layered wisdom. Soldiers had learned to internalize its guidance, blending it with observation, instinct, and ethical judgment to make decisions that were simultaneously tactical and philosophical. The scroll had become the axis around which their survival revolved, guiding action while provoking reflection on the human condition and the burdens of command. Isolation weighed heavier than ever. Nights were bitterly cold, sleep came in fragments, and the constant need for vigilance left the men in a near-perpetual state of tension. Fires, kept minimal to avoid detection, offered little comfort, and hunger gnawed relentlessly at both body and mind. The psychological strain amplified every sound and shadow. The crack of a branch might signal pursuit, the flutter of leaves could indicate movement, and distant echoes suggested an unseen presence. The commander, aware of the mental toll, continued to implement structured routines, observation exercises, and meditative practices inspired by the scroll, combining Spartan discipline with heightened psychological endurance. These measures helped maintain focus, cohesion, and the fragile balance of morale under extreme and unrelenting pressure. Physical hazards had escalated to the point where every movement required acute attention. Narrow ledges, jagged rocks, loose scree, and hidden crevices demanded constant vigilance. Water sources were rare and exposed, and foraging for sustenance added another layer of risk. The mountains dictated rhythm, strategy, and pace, enforcing lessons in adaptation, foresight, and perceptual acuity that far exceeded anything experienced in Spartan training grounds. The men had learned to move with deliberate precision, to observe minute environmental changes, and to integrate every piece of information into decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. External threats persisted, ambiguous and unsettling. Scouts reported footprints inconsistent with Spartan patterns, faint remnants of fires, and subtle signs that the unit was being observed. Whether these signs indicated insurgents, rival factions, or an unknown presence, the commander relied on careful interpretation, using the scroll to convert ambiguity into actionable intelligence. Maintaining stealth, cohesion, and readiness in the face of uncertain danger became a defining feature of the unit's operations. The ethical dimension reached its zenith. The scroll's guidance emphasized that obedience alone was insufficient. Moral discernment was essential. Lines such as "conscience weighs heavier than command," and "sometimes silence preserves what action would destroy," underscored the profound weight of responsibility the commander bore. Decisions now involved survival, loyalty, and honor simultaneously, creating a moral crucible intensified by isolation and extreme risk. Each choice carried long-term consequences, shaping the identity of the unit and the legacy of its leader. Operational tactics had become nearly instinctual. Movements were silent, precise, and synchronized, with every soldier reading the environment and each other to anticipate danger. Observations of subtle shifts in foliage, animal behavior, and soil patterns were interpreted with a level of acuity honed over weeks of extreme conditions. The mountains had become instructors, imparting lessons in patience, foresight, and resilience that transcended traditional Spartan education. Instinct, strategy, and ethical reflection had fused into a seamless approach to survival. Camaraderie and trust were now the keystones of endurance. Each soldier's vigilance safeguarded the entire unit, while the commander's leadership reinforced discipline, ethical judgment, and cohesion. The group functioned as a single entity, capable of responding with collective intelligence to the constant and multifaceted threats of the mountains. By the 23rd day, the unit had reached a state of profound integration. Physical endurance, psychological resilience, and ethical discernment had become inseparable. The Black Scroll remained the central guide, framing perception, informing strategy, and offering insight into both natural and human threats. The mission had become a multidimensional trial, in which every action, observation, and decision carried amplified consequence. Section 23 closes with a sense of haunting resolution. The mountains, now fully realized as conscious forces shaping every aspect of the journey, have tested the limits of human capability and moral judgment. The Black Scroll continues to illuminate, challenge, and guide. Yet the ultimate fate of the commander and his men hangs in a tense equilibrium between revelation and disappearance. The story reaches its emotional climax here, leaving an indelible mark on those who imagine it. A tale of endurance, mystery, and the profound intersection of human courage, perception, and conscience, echoing across history and time. The culmination of the journey had arrived. The unit now stood at the edge of the most remote and unforgiving portion of the Teejito's range, where jagged peaks thrust into the clouds and shadowed valleys stretched into depths so black they seemed eternal. Here, the mountains were no longer mere obstacles. They were active forces, testing the limits of endurance, judgment, and morality. Every step was a negotiation with an environment that offered both shelter and peril in the same instant. Narrow ridges twisted like the spines of some colossal beast, cliffs dropped away into unseen voids, and fractured paths threatened collapse under the slightest misstep. The wind, a constant and unpredictable companion, howled through the passes with a voice that seemed almost alive, carrying sounds that teased perception, suggesting danger where there was none, or perhaps warning of real threats unseen. Even the most disciplined Spartans, soldiers schooled in fearlessness and hardship, felt their senses betray them in this alien landscape. Perception, intuition, and moral clarity had become as vital as physical skill, strength, or training. Here, the mountains themselves had become arbiters, silent and impartial, shaping the men's actions and thoughts, challenging their understanding of the natural and human world alike. The Black Scroll, now fully internalized, was more than a tactical guide. It had become the lens through which the men interpreted every threat, opportunity, and moral dilemma. Its words, once mysterious, now resonated with lived experience. Lines such as, "Move where the stone and shadow converge, but trust neither fully," and "The unseen protects what the seen would destroy" were no longer abstract. They were actionable principles, dictating movement, vigilance, and ethical discernment. Every ridge climbed, every narrow passage crossed, every temporary camp chosen was informed by these precepts. The scroll demanded more than obedience. It demanded reflection, judgment, and courage. It fused philosophy and strategy, demanding that each soldier integrate mind, body, and conscience into a continuous practice of vigilance and ethical awareness. Isolation had intensified to an almost unbearable degree. Nights were bitterly cold, stretching endlessly under a starless sky where the moon rarely penetrated the thick mist that shrouded the peaks. Fires could not be maintained for warmth without risking exposure, and sleep came in short, fitful fragments. Hunger gnawed relentlessly at both the body and morale. Every sound, rocks sliding, distant waterfalls, wind whistling through crevices, was amplified, demanding interpretation, creating anxiety that fed upon itself. The mind, trained for clarity, now worked overtime to distinguish threat from illusion. The commander understood the fragile equilibrium of human psychology under these conditions. He instituted a rigorous routine inspired by the Black Scroll. Observation drills, meditative exercises, reflection sessions, and careful rotations of watch duty. This was not merely discipline. It was a survival strategy, one that recognized the mountains as adversaries and instructors simultaneously. The men were learning to transform fear into heightened awareness, fatigue into precise timing, and uncertainty into strategic advantage. Physical hazards grew progressively more extreme. The paths had narrowed into perilous ridges, jagged and unstable, while loose scree and moss-covered rock made every step a challenge to balance and coordination. Hidden crevices and sudden fissures threatened to swallow a man whole, and even minor miscalculations carried immediate danger. Water sources were rare and exposed, forcing soldiers to forage under risky circumstances, sometimes in places that offered no cover from sight. Rations were minimal, demanding extreme caution in their management and consumption. The mountains dictated rhythm, pace, and even the timing of rest. Survival was no longer a test of endurance alone. It demanded keen perception, foresight, and the ability to make instantaneous decisions under immense pressure. Mistakes could not simply be corrected, they could be fatal. Encounters with other presences, though often fleeting and ambiguous, had begun to exert a psychological toll. Scouts reported footprints that defied identification, subtle disturbances in the terrain, and the faint traces of extinguished fires. The source of these signs was uncertain. Could they be local insurgents, rival Spartan factions, or forces as yet unknown? The commander relied heavily on the Black Scroll to navigate these uncertainties. Ambiguity itself became a tool, forcing the men to integrate observation, deduction, and intuition into every movement. Awareness of unseen observers heightened tension, but it also sharpened attention, allowing the soldiers to detect threats far earlier than they might have otherwise. Every sound, shadow, and shift in the environment was interpreted as both potential danger and opportunity, creating a continuous cycle of assessment and adjustment that had become second nature to the unit. The ethical dimension of the mission had become inseparable from survival. The Black Scroll emphasized that obedience alone was insufficient. Moral judgment was critical. Lines such as, "Conscience weighs heavier than command," and "Silence may preserve what action would destroy," crystallized the weight of responsibility resting on the commander's shoulders. Every decision now carried layered consequences: immediate survival, the cohesion and trust of the unit, and the moral integrity of each man. Isolation and environmental extremity amplified the stakes, forcing reflection on the principles of honor, loyalty, and human duty. Soldiers were no longer simply responding to physical threats. They were interpreting a landscape rich in moral and philosophical challenge, where every action reverberated beyond the moment. Operational tactics had become instinctual yet precise. Movements were silent, fluid, and meticulously coordinated. Soldiers interpreted subtle shifts in the environment, changes in wind direction, foliage, wildlife behavior, and soil disturbances, with uncanny accuracy. Each observation was translated into practical decisions that safeguarded both life and moral principle. The mountains were no longer mere terrain. They were both adversary and teacher, imparting lessons in patience, foresight, resilience, and situational awareness that could not be acquired in any conventional Spartan training grounds. Instinct, ethical reflection, and tactical reasoning had fused into a unified approach to action and survival. Camaraderie and trust had become indispensable. Each soldier's vigilance was a safeguard for the entire unit, while the commander's leadership reinforced cohesion, discipline, and ethical decision-making. The men functioned as a single organism, responding collectively to the relentless demands of the mountains. Mutual trust and shared responsibility ensured that each decision, each maneuver, was supported by the group, transforming individual skill and awareness into a collective force capable of confronting extreme danger. By the 24th day, the unit had achieved a level of integration that approached a state of holistic capability. Physical endurance, psychological resilience, and ethical discernment had become inseparable. The Black Scroll remained the central axis of guidance, illuminating threats, structuring decisions, and providing moral clarity in an environment that was as unpredictable as it was hostile. The mission had evolved into a multidimensional trial, a crucible in which survival, observation, moral reflection, and strategic reasoning had fused into a singular test of human capability. As the soldiers paused on a narrow ledge overlooking a valley shrouded in mist, the full scale of the mountain's dominion over them became apparent. Every shadow seemed alive, every gust of wind a messenger of unseen judgment. They were acutely aware that the next steps, each one carefully calculated and measured, would determine not only the outcome of this expedition but the preservation of their honor, the unity of the unit, and the integrity of the mission itself. The Black Scroll, folded carefully in the commander's hands, had guided them through weeks of isolation, extreme danger, and moral complexity. Its lessons were now fully realized in the men's movements, decisions, and interactions. Yet even in this moment of mastery and heightened awareness, uncertainty lingered. The mountains, while instructive, were indifferent arbiters, danger and moral challenge were ever present. The soldiers were aware that their survival depended not only on skill and vigilance but on their ability to interpret signals invisible to those untrained, to act decisively yet ethically, and to maintain cohesion under conditions that eroded mind and body alike. Every observation and choice carried amplified weight. Every shadow could conceal both danger and insight. Section 24 closes with profound emotional and philosophical resonance. The mountains, fully realized as sentient forces, had tested the limits of endurance, perception, and moral judgment. The Black Scroll had served as compass, instructor, and moral guide, shaping every decision and offering clarity amidst chaos. The unit had confronted extreme physical challenges, psychological strain, and ethical dilemmas that demanded integration of body, mind, and conscience. As they prepared to move forward into the final stages of their journey, the soldiers were acutely aware that the culmination of all these trials would define not only the outcome of this expedition but also the legacy of the commander, the unit, and the mysterious Black Scroll itself. What they had endured, learned, and discovered would echo far beyond the Teejados, leaving an indelible mark on history and the imagination of all who would come to hear their story. The final stretch of the journey had arrived. The unit stood on the precipice of the Teejados Range's most remote and forbidding territory, a place so wild and untamed that it seemed to exist beyond the normal bounds of time and space. Peaks rose sharply into the mist-laden sky, jagged and unyielding, while shadowed valleys stretched into depths so black that even the bravest soldier could not discern their bottom. The mountains were no longer merely obstacles. They had transformed into living forces, shaping perception, influencing decision-making, and testing the moral and psychological limits of every man. Each ridge, crevice, and ledge demanded careful attention. Every movement carried risk, every choice the potential for catastrophe. The wind, a persistent and haunting companion, screamed through narrow passes and whistled over ridges with a voice that seemed almost sentient, carrying ambiguous sounds that teased perception. Was it the distant fall of stones, the cries of animals, or the whisper of unseen eyes? Even the most seasoned Spartan soldiers, trained to endure fear, hunger, and fatigue, felt the pull of uncertainty. Survival here required more than strength or skill. It demanded acute awareness, instinctive judgment, and moral clarity. The mountains had become judges, arbiters, and teachers all at once. The Black Scroll had become the axis upon which all action revolved. Its lines, cryptic, layered, and now internalized, served as compass, guide, and moral framework. Words like "the unseen carries truth," "the visible misleads," and "he who obeys without thought is blind to the path" were no longer abstract instructions. They were practical principles informing every movement and decision. The soldiers relied on them not only for survival but to interpret the mysteries of the landscape itself, translating metaphor into tactical action. The scroll demanded reflection and ethical consideration. It forced the commander and his men to question instinct, to weigh consequences, and to harmonize individual judgment with collective responsibility. It was both a manual of action and a mirror of the human soul. Isolation had reached its peak. Nights were bitter, dark, and endless, with little opportunity for restful sleep. Fires, minimized for safety, provided scarce warmth and little comfort. Hunger gnawed persistently at morale, while fatigue made every decision heavier and every movement more precarious. Every sound, the shifting of rocks, the whistle of the wind, the distant echo of water, was magnified, demanding interpretation and vigilance. Psychological strain was constant, forcing the soldiers to confront fear in its rawest form. To mitigate this, the commander enforced routines inspired by the scroll: observation exercises, meditation, reflective dialogues, and rotations of watch duty. Spartan discipline fused with heightened psychological resilience, creating an awareness that allowed the men to transform fear into strategic clarity, tension into sharpened focus, and uncertainty into adaptive action. Physical hazards had escalated beyond the bounds of ordinary danger. Narrow ridges offered little room for error. Jagged rocks jutted from the mountainside like the teeth of some colossal predator, and unseen fissures threatened sudden falls. Water sources were scarce and exposed, forcing the soldiers into risky maneuvers to sustain themselves. Rations were minimal, demanding precise management and strategic consumption. The mountains dictated the tempo of movement, the timing of rest, and the strategy of foraging. Survival required integration of skill, observation, foresight, and decisive judgment. Mistakes could not simply be corrected. They could be fatal. Every step, every choice carried amplified consequences. Signs of other presences became increasingly ominous and inscrutable. Scouts reported footprints inconsistent with Spartan patterns, faint remnants of extinguished fires, and subtle disturbances suggesting unseen observers. Whether these signs pointed to insurgents, rival Spartan factions, or unknown forces remained uncertain. The commander relied on the Black Scroll to interpret ambiguity, transforming uncertainty into tactical advantage. Every shadow, sound, or disruption of the natural environment became data, a piece of a puzzle whose solution demanded both caution and decisive action. The mountains themselves seemed to teach this lesson. Ambiguity is both challenge and opportunity, and the mind that cannot navigate it will falter. The ethical dimension of the mission had reached its apex. The Black Scroll made clear that obedience alone was insufficient. Moral discernment was critical. Lines such as "conscience outweighs command" and "silence preserves what action would destroy" underscored the profound responsibility resting on the commander and his men. Every decision now intertwined survival, loyalty, and honor, creating a moral crucible in which strategy and conscience were inseparable. The soldiers were confronted with choices where every path carried both risk and ethical consequence, shaping not only immediate outcomes but the character and legacy of the unit. Isolation and extreme danger amplified this crucible, forcing reflection on courage, integrity, and the burdens of leadership. Operational precision had become instinctive. Movements were silent, fluid, and coordinated, guided by a keen awareness of both the environment and the actions of fellow soldiers. Observations of subtle environmental cues, shifts in wind, the direction of leaves, the behavior of animals, and impressions in soil, were interpreted with near-perfect acuity. Each observation translated into tactical decisions that safeguarded the men while maintaining moral integrity. The mountains, both adversary and teacher, imparted lessons in foresight, patience, and resilience that no Spartan training could replicate. Instinct, strategy, and ethical reflection had fused into a single approach to survival and decision-making. Camaraderie and trust were indispensable. Each soldier's vigilance protected the entire unit. The commander's leadership reinforced cohesion, ethical judgment, and discipline, creating a collective organism capable of responding to the mountain's relentless challenges. Mutual trust and shared responsibility ensured that decisions were supported by the group, blending individual skill with collective intelligence. Survival depended equally on personal excellence and the capacity to act as a unified force, highlighting the inseparable nature of trust, judgment, and cooperation. By the 25th day, the unit had achieved the ultimate integration of skill, mind, and conscience. Physical endurance, psychological resilience, and ethical discernment were inseparable, forming a holistic capability capable of responding to the mountain's demands. The Black Scroll had become a constant companion, guiding action, illuminating unseen threats, and providing moral clarity. The mission had evolved into a trial unlike any other, a multidimensional crucible where survival, observation, moral judgment, and strategic reasoning converged into a singular test of human capability. As the soldiers paused on the final ledge overlooking a vast expanse of mist-filled valleys and jagged peaks, the magnitude of their journey became fully apparent. The mountains had tested them, stripped them of certainty, and demanded the total integration of mind, body, and soul. Every challenge, environmental, ethical, and psychological, had honed them into a unit capable of extraordinary vigilance, resilience, and moral courage. The Black Scroll, folded carefully in the commander's hands, had guided them through this ordeal, offering insight and wisdom at every critical juncture. Its lessons were no longer theoretical. They were lived experience, reflected in every movement, decision, and thought. Even in this final moment, uncertainty remained. The mountains, though navigated with skill, were impartial arbiters. Danger could emerge in any form, and the consequences of a single misjudgment could be devastating. Yet the unit had learned to confront uncertainty with courage and ethical clarity. They understood that survival required more than physical endurance. It demanded moral discernment, collective trust, and the ability to interpret subtle signs that others would overlook. Every shadow, every gust of wind, every distant sound carried meaning, and the men were now attuned to the hidden language of the mountains. Section 25 closes with a profound sense of resolution, reflection, and lingering mystery. The mountains, having tested the limits of human capability and moral judgment, now stood as silent witnesses to the culmination of the journey. The Black Scroll had guided, illuminated, and challenged, shaping the soldier's actions, perceptions, and conscience. The commander and his men had faced extreme physical, psychological, and ethical trials, emerging transformed by the experience. The narrative concludes with a haunting yet powerful question. What if the lessons they had learned, the courage they had embodied, and the secrets they had uncovered altered not only their fate, but the broader understanding of history, honor, and the hidden truths of the world? The echoes of their journey would reverberate far beyond the mountains, a story of endurance, morality, and mystery that would linger in the imagination of all who encountered it. Every step, every decision, every act of courage and reflection had been a testament to the human spirit tested to its limits. In the silent grandeur of the Teejitos, the commander and his unit had discovered not only the meaning of survival but the profound weight of conscience, the enduring power of trust, and the haunting, eternal mystery of the Black Scroll that had guided them through shadows and into legend.